Charlotte Hayes set her suitcase down in the dirt and did not cry. 3 days, 7 doors. Every single one closed in her face, not because her hands weren't willing, not because her heart wasn't ready, but because her body didn't fit what they imagined a hired woman should look like. She straightened her spine, picked up that worn leather case, and kept walking. If you've ever been told you were too much or not enough, stay until the very end of this story. Subscribe to the channel, follow Charlotte's journey, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The summer of 1879 did not arrive gently in Dust Creek, Texas. It came hard and flat and mean the way West Texas summers always did, pressing down on every living thing, until the land cracked and the rivers thinned to muddy ribbons and the horses stood motionless in whatever shade they could find. The town itself sat low against the earth like something embarrassed to be there. One main road of packed red dirt. A general store. A livery stable. A church with a crooked steeple. A saloon where men talked too loud about things they didn't understand. And 7 households that had in the past 3 days closed their front doors in Charlotte Hayes's face. She was 24 years old. She had traveled 42 miles by stagecoach from Abilene with $11.40, a single leather suitcase held together at the latch with a strip of rawhide and a letter of character reference from Reverend Thomas Aldridge of the First Methodist Church of Abilene, who had written in careful script that Charlotte Hayes was a woman of exceptional skill, godly character, and tireless work ethic. The letter had not helped. Charlotte stood now on the wooden boardwalk outside McCready's General Store, holding the suitcase in both hands in front of her, like something she wasn't sure she had the right to carry. The morning sun was already punishing. Sweat gathered at her temples and at the back of her neck beneath the neat braid she'd pinned up before dawn. Her dress was clean. Her boots were dusted. She had made absolutely certain of both every single morning, because she understood that people decided things about her before she opened her mouth, and she refused to give them anything extra to decide. She was beautiful. Anyone with honest eyes could see it. A face that was round and soft and warm with cheekbones that caught light in a way that made strangers look twice, and dark eyes that held something deep and patient in them. The kind of eyes that had seen difficulty and chosen deliberately not to become hard. Her mouth was full and gentle, and when she smiled, which she did carefully and not often among strangers, something in the room shifted. People just didn't always know why. Her body was large, full and heavy and broad, in a way that the women of Dust Creek, with their corseted waists and their careful opinions, found difficult to look past. And they didn't try. In 1879 in West Texas, a woman Charlotte's size was a thing to comment on before you knew her name. The first door had been the Hendersons. Martha Henderson had opened it on Monday morning, looked Charlotte up and down from the porch step and said, "I'm sorry, dear. I need someone who can move quickly through a kitchen. I don't think you'd manage." Charlotte had said, I've been managing kitchens since I was 9 years old." Martha Henderson had said, "I'm sure you have," and closed the door. The second had been the Prescotts. Harold Prescott hadn't even let her finish her sentence. He'd looked at her over her letter of reference like it was written in a language he didn't respect, and said, "We need someone presentable, for when company comes." She'd said, "I'm standing here presentable, Mr. Prescott." He'd said, "That'll be all," and shut the door in her face. The third, fourth, and fifth had offered variations of the same. Too large, not the right look, wouldn't want the neighbors to think. One woman, Mrs. Calloway, who wore 3 rings on each hand and smelled of rosewater, had actually laughed. Not a mean laugh, she'd probably told herself later. Just a surprised one. The kind of laugh that comes out when you see something you weren't expecting, and your manners fail you for just a moment. Charlotte had stood very still and let the laugh finish. Then she'd said, "Thank you for your time, ma'am," turned around and walked back down the path with her shoulders perfectly square. That had been yesterday. The 6th door had been the Alcotts, and Mrs. Alcott had told her with genuine pity in her voice, which was somehow worse than the contempt, that she really ought to try somewhere more suited to her. "Perhaps a laundry," she'd said. "You wouldn't be on display there, dear. It might be more comfortable for everyone." Charlotte had thanked her. She had walked 2 blocks, turned behind the livery stable where no one could see her, and pressed her back against the weathered wood and breathed for 60 seconds. just breathed, not crying. She had made herself a rule about crying in public years ago, and she did not intend to break it in Dust Creek, Texas of all places. Then she'd fixed her braid, picked up her suitcase, and gone to find the seventh door. The seventh had been this morning, before dawn. The Garfield family, who were said to need a cook and housekeeper urgently on account of Mrs. Garfield being ill. Charlotte had arrived early because she believed arriving early said something about a person that no letter of reference could say better. Tom Garfield had looked at her. He'd looked at her like he was solving a math problem and kept getting the wrong answer. Then he'd looked past her shoulder at the empty road, as if hoping someone else might appear. "I expected someone else," he finally said. "I'm Charlotte Hayes, sir. I responded to your notice at the store." "Yes." He rubbed the back of his neck. "You're bigger than I expected." Charlotte kept her face smooth and clean. "I cook well, Mr. Garfield. I clean well. I work without complaint, and I don't steal. I can provide a reference from Reverend Aldridge in Abilene, I'm sure." He shifted on his feet. "It's just it don't look right is all. Rhonda's particular about things looking right." "Your wife is ill, Mr. Garfield. I imagine what she needs right now is someone who can cook and clean and keep the house running, not someone who looks a particular way." He had appreciated the argument. She could see it in his face, the small, reluctant flicker of logic agreeing with her. Then he'd glanced past her again at the road. "I think we'll manage on our own," he said. And he closed the door. Charlotte had stood on that porch for a moment longer than necessary. Just a moment. Long enough to let the quiet settle around her, to feel the particular weight of that specific morning, that specific door, that specific closure. Then she'd stepped off the porch, walked the 6 blocks back to the center of town, and set her suitcase down in the dirt in front of McCready's general store. She was running out of names on her list. She was running out of money. She was not running out of the thing she carried deepest, which was a stubborn, inextinguishable conviction that a woman's worth was not located in her dress size or in the approval of people who made their decisions in the first 3 seconds of looking at her. But she was tired. She was very tired. Behind her, through the open door of the general store, she could hear 2 women talking. She recognized one of the voices. Mrs. Pauline Driscoll, who ran the millinery shop on the north end of Main Street and who had an opinion about everything in Dust Creek and shared all of them freely. "Saw her at the Garfields this morning," Pauline was saying. "Tom sent her away." "Poor thing." The second woman's voice was lower. Ruth something. Charlotte didn't know the last name. "Poor thing nothing," Pauline said. "It's practical, Ruth. You can't have a woman that size running a household. She'd eat you out of provisions in a week." Pauline. "I'm not being cruel. I'm being realistic. She came all this way from Abilene for nothing. She'd have done better staying where someone knew her. Maybe she had reasons for leaving." "Well?" A pause. Charlotte could hear the rustle of fabric. "She won't find work here, I can tell you that. Not with any decent family. Maybe the saloon will take her on." The second woman made a sound of quiet objection. Pauline Driscoll moved on to a different subject. Charlotte picked up her suitcase. She did not go inside to respond. She had learned long ago that responding to Pauline Driscoll's was like pouring water into sand. It went nowhere. It changed nothing. It only left you feeling drained and foolish. She turned and looked down the street. At the far end, near the water trough, a man was standing next to a brown horse, running his hand along the animal's neck in an absent, practiced way. He was tall, considerably taller than most men on the street, and broad across the shoulders, with the particular kind of stillness that belongs to people who spend a great deal of time alone in open country. His hat was dark, pulled low against the sun. His jacket was the color of worn leather. He wasn't looking at the store, or at the street, or at any of the usual things men in town looked at. He was looking at her. Charlotte met his gaze. She expected him to look away. Most people did when they realized they'd been caught staring because they had the decency to feel some small degree of embarrassment about whatever they'd been thinking. He didn't look away. He just kept looking. Steadily. Without the particular quality of assessment, she had grown so familiar with that calculating, measuring look that moved from face to figure and back again. He looked at her the way a person looks at something they are genuinely trying to understand. Then something happened that Charlotte had not been expecting. An old woman came around the corner of the store. Delia Morton. Charlotte would later learn, 73 years old, arthritic and too proud to ask for help with anything. She was carrying a crate, too large for her, too heavy. She had it pressed against her chest, and her face was tight with the effort, and she was moving slowly along the boardwalk with the grim determination of someone who had decided they were going to do this thing and refused to reconsider. Charlotte didn't think. She set her suitcase down, moved to Mrs. Morton's side, and put her hands under the far end of the crate. "Let me take the other end, ma'am." Mrs. Morton looked at her sideways, startled. "I don't need—" "I know," Charlotte said. "Just let me help anyway." They carried the crate together to the old woman's cart. Charlotte lifted it up and settled it in without any show of difficulty, because she was strong in a way people consistently underestimated, and she had stopped being surprised by that. Mrs. Morton looked at her hands, then up at her face. "Thank you," she said with the slightly bewildered expression of a woman not accustomed to accepting help from strangers. "Yes, ma'am," Charlotte said. She went back, picked up her suitcase, and stood again on the boardwalk. She didn't look toward the water trough, but she was aware in the way you are aware of certain presences without looking directly at them that the tall man was still there. She heard his boots on the street before she saw him coming. He moved deliberately. No hurry, but no hesitation either. He crossed the distance between the water trough and the store in a straight line, the brown horse trailing behind him on the lead rope, as if it had learned long ago that this was just what they did. Wherever he went, the horse followed. He stopped a few feet away from her. He took off his hat. Up close he was. She registered this in a single quick practical inventory. Older, perhaps mid-30s. His hair was dark brown and slightly overlong, like a man who spent more time on a ranch than in a barber's chair. His jaw was rough with several days of stubble. His eyes were the color of dark river water, and they held the same direct, undefensive quality she'd noticed from across the street. A face that had been weathered by real weather and real work. Lines at the corners of his eyes. A small scar below his left cheekbone. How was the best-looking man she had seen since Abilene, and she noticed it the way she noticed anything quickly, practically, and without letting it affect her posture. "Miss Hayes," he said. His voice was low and very steady. She blinked. "You know my name?" "Small town," he said. "Word moves." He turned his hat in his hands once. "I'm William Carter. I run a cattle operation about 4 miles north of town. Mountain View Ranch." She waited. "I need a cook," he said. "And a housekeeper. The position's been open for some time. I haven't found anyone suited." Charlotte looked at him directly. "Mr. Carter." "Yes, ma'am. I've been turned away from 7 homes in 3 days in this town. I want to be straightforward with you before we go any further. If you're going to look at me and then find a reason that doesn't have anything to do with my cooking or my work, I would appreciate you saying so now rather than after I've told you my qualifications." A small silence. He didn't flinch. He didn't look away. Something moved in his expression. Not offense, not amusement. Something more like recognition. "Miss Hayes," he said. "I watched you help Delia Morton with that crate. Nobody asked you. Nobody thanked you. You just did it." He paused. "That tells me considerably more about a person than their qualifications." Charlotte said nothing. "I also watched 7 doors close on you this week," he continued. "And I watched you walk away from every single one of them with your head up. That tells me something too." He put his hat back on. "I'm offering you the position if you want it. Fair wage, your own room, Sundays off. I'm gone most days before dawn, and I don't have complicated expectations. I just need someone who can keep a house running and cook a meal that doesn't taste like regret." The sound from inside McCready's store had gone very quiet. Charlotte knew without turning around that Pauline Driscoll was listening. She could feel the quality of that specific silence. The listening kind. She also knew that saying yes to this man meant 4 miles outside of town, and a ranch she hadn't seen, and a situation she couldn't entirely evaluate, and that those were facts a sensible woman considered. She considered them. "I'd like to see the contract in writing," she said. I'll write one up tonight, William said. You have my word until then. Your word. She looked at him steadily. All right, Mr. Carter. She picked up her suitcase. When do we leave? Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. Close. Now, he said, if you're ready. I've been ready, Charlotte said, for 3 days. The voice from behind them was loud enough that it wasn't an accident. William Carter. He turned. Pauline Driscoll stood in the doorway of McCready's. She had her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, despite the heat, which was something she did when she wanted to look authoritative. Behind her, Ruth Ackerman hung back near the fabric bolts, looking uncomfortable. William, Pauline said. Do you know what you're doing? Generally, yes, William said. I'm speaking plainly. Pauline stepped onto the boardwalk. She did not look at Charlotte. She addressed William entirely, which was a particular kind of rudeness that Charlotte had learned to recognize as its own statement. People will talk. They already do, William said. Your reputation, Pauline. His voice didn't sharpen. It didn't need to. It simply became very clear the way a road becomes clear when the fog lifts. I need a cook. Miss Hayes is looking for work. That's the beginning and end of it, and I'd appreciate it if you'd let us get on with our day. Pauline Driscoll's chin came up. She is not right for the position. You've seen her work. I've seen her. Then you haven't seen anything useful, William said. He touched the brim of his hat. Good morning, Pauline. He turned, took the horse's lead rope in his hand, and started down the street. Charlotte picked up her suitcase and walked beside him. She did not look at Pauline Driscoll. She did not look at the other faces turning toward them from doorways and windows, the barber, the blacksmith's apprentice, the 2 women from the dressmakers who had stopped on the boardwalk to watch. She looked at the road ahead. 4 miles north. A position, a room, a fair wage. 1 door finally that had opened. They rode out of Dust Creek in a wagon. William's wagon, which he'd left in front of the livery before coming into town that morning. He helped her up onto the bench without making anything of it. No performance of effort or commentary on weight. Just a straightforward hand offered and taken, and then he went around to the other side and climbed up, and they set off. For the first mile, neither of them spoke. Charlotte held her suitcase on her lap and watched the land change around her as they moved away from town. The way the road narrowed, and the grass got longer, and the sky opened up in a way it never quite managed to do, above a street full of buildings. The heat was still terrible. The dry Texas air smelled of dust and dry grass, and somewhere distantly cattle. It was William who spoke first. You have family in Abilene? No, Charlotte said. I was raised in the Methodist Children's Home there, aged out at 18. A pause. That's when you started taking household work? Yes, 6 years of it. She glanced at him. I'm good at it, Mr. Carter. I want you to know that plainly, since we haven't discussed specifics. I can cook, not just feed people, actually cook. I can keep accounts. I can manage provisions and ordering. I can doctor minor injuries, preserve food for winter, manage a kitchen garden if there's one. And I keep to myself, and I don't make trouble. He listened without interrupting. Good, he said when she was done. You're not going to test me, she asked. I'll taste your cooking at dinner. A beat. That'll tell me what I need to know. She found herself almost smiling. Almost. What do you cook currently? She asked. Poorly, he said. Do you have provisions? Some. Sent a boy to the store this morning for flour and salt pork. There's a root cellar with dry goods, a smokehouse, chickens, a kitchen garden that's largely gone to weeds because nobody's been minding it. How long have you been without a cook? 4 months. 4 months. She calculated this quickly. And before that? He was quiet for a moment. My mother, he said. She passed in February. Charlotte looked at his profile, the line of his jaw, the careful stillness of a man who said one true painful thing, and then moved on because that was what he knew how to do. I'm sorry, she said. Yes, he said, simply. They didn't say anything after that for a while. The wagon moved north. The road got rougher and then flattened out again. A hawk turned high and slow overhead. Charlotte thought about the past 3 days, the 7 doors, Mrs. Alcott's pity. Pauline Driscoll's voice carrying through the open wall of a store talking about her like she wasn't a person standing within earshot. Tom Garfield looking past her at the road as if better options might materialize. She thought about standing behind the livery stable with her back against the wall, counting to 60, not crying. She thought about Reverend Aldridge's letter in her pocket folded into careful thirds, with its good solid words about her character that nobody had wanted to read. She thought about William Carter watching from across the street. Not assessing her, just watching. Watching her help an old woman with a crate that was too heavy when nobody asked, and nobody would know. "Mr. Carter," she said. "William," he said. She paused. "William." It sat strangely on her, familiar in a way she hadn't earned yet. "Why did you come over?" He kept his eyes on the road. "Because the town was doing what it does," he said, "and I was tired of watching." "You could have left it alone," she said. "It wouldn't have been your business." "No," he agreed. "It wouldn't have." He shifted the reins in his hands. "I reckon that's exactly why." Mountain View Ranch was not what Charlotte had been imagining during the 4-mile ride. She had pictured something austere, functional. A working man's property, well kept in the ways that mattered for cattle and equipment, and not much else. It was larger than she expected. The main house was built from cedar plank and fieldstone, 2 stories with a wide front porch that ran the full length of the building, and a pitched roof that cast deep shade in the afternoon. Behind it, she could see a barn, a smokehouse, 3 outbuildings, and a bunkhouse for the ranch hands further back. A creek ran through the near pasture, thin, with late summer heat, but still moving. There were oak trees along the creek bank, old ones, the kind that had been there before the house was built and would be there after it was gone. It was, despite everything, a beautiful property. It was also visibly profoundly empty. That was the thing she felt most strongly when William helped her down from the wagon and she stood in front of the house for the first time. Not just the absence of people. There were ranch hands, she could see them in the distance moving around the barn. Not just the absence of noise, though the house was very quiet. It was the specific absence of being lived in, of being cared for. The porch boards were warped in one corner where water had been sitting. The window boxes were full of dead plants, their dried stalks listing sideways. The front door's hinge was loose, so it didn't hang quite straight. These were small things. Things that accumulated slowly over months when there was no one watching them. She thought about what he'd said. "My mother." She passed in February. 4 months of a man eating poorly and moving through a house that was becoming slowly less of a home. "This way," William said, and held the door for her. Inside she catalogued quickly and without making her assessment visible on her face. The kitchen was large, a good kitchen with a proper iron range and a long work table and deep shelving. It was dirty with disuse, not with filth. There was a layer of dust on the upper shelves. The grease trap in the range needed clearing. There was a pile of tin plates stacked in the dry sink that hadn't been washed in a while. But the bones of it were good. "Your room is this way." He led her down a short hallway off the kitchen to a door at the back of the house. The room behind it was small, but private. A window that faced east, a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, a peg on the wall for hanging clothes. A braided rug on the floor that had once been colorful and was faded now, but still present. Charlotte set her suitcase on the bed. "It's fine," she said. "I know it's plain." "It's fine, William." She meant it. She turned to face him in the doorway. He was too tall for it, had to angle his head slightly. "When are your ranch hands expecting dinner?" He blinked. 6 o'clock. "What time is it now?" 2:15. "How many men?" 4 in the bunkhouse. Myself. 5 men, she said. "All right." She moved past him back into the kitchen, rolling up her sleeves as she went. "I'll need the root cellar opened and an inventory of what you have. And I'll need that window opened. It's too hot to cook with it shut." He stood in the kitchen doorway, and watched her move into the space with the particular authority of someone who has been competent at something for a very long time and knows exactly where to start. "Miss Hayes," he said. "Charlotte," she said, and she was already pulling open the cellar door to see what she had to work with. By 5:45, the kitchen smelled like something that hadn't lived in that house for 4 months. It smelled like cooking, real cooking, not the desperate, joyless business of a man heating salt pork in a pan because he needed fuel to keep working. It smelled like onions, softened in butter and biscuit dough rising, and a pot of beans that had been going for 3 hours with a ham hock and black pepper. And it smelled like something sweet, a dried apple pie she'd found the makings for in the back of the dry goods shelf, reconstituted with brown sugar and cinnamon. Ranch hands appeared at the back door right at 6. 4 of them. They came in with the manner of men who had been working hard in the heat all day and were accustomed to receiving food that kept them functioning but gave them nothing to look forward to. They stopped just inside the kitchen door. Charlie Briggs, the oldest with a gray-streaked beard and 30 years of ranch work in his posture, looked at the table that Charlotte had set, and then at the stove, and then at Charlotte. "You the new cook," he said. "Charlotte Hayes." She handed him a bowl. "Sit down, please." The 4 of them sat. She served. She didn't make a performance of it. She moved efficiently between the stove and the table, setting down the beans and the biscuits and the sliced pork and the corn she'd found in the cellar and stewed with a little bacon fat and sage. William came in from outside when everyone else was already seated. He'd washed up at the pump. She could see the water still at his temples. He sat at the head of the table in the same way he seemed to do everything without drama, just direct. He looked at the food. Then he looked at her. She was watching him from near the stove, her arms slightly crossed, waiting with the professional patience of someone who had been cooking for people's judgment for 6 years and had learned to read faces. He picked up his fork. The kitchen was quiet. He took one bite of the beans. Then he said, and he said it simply without performance, the way a man states a plain fact, "Charlotte. Yes. This is the best food that has come out of this kitchen since my mother was alive." Charlie Briggs across the table made a sound of sincere agreement around a biscuit. Charlotte unfolded her arms. She didn't say anything. She turned back to the stove, and if something shifted in her expression in that private moment, before she turned something that was not quite a smile, but was close to relief, the particular relief of a person who has been told finally by something concrete and real, "Yes, you belong here," then that was hers alone. The kitchen noise picked up. Forks against tin. Charlie Briggs asking for another biscuit. The youngest ranch hand, a boy of 17 named Pete, who looked like he hadn't had a home-cooked meal in months, eating with the focused intensity of someone doing important work. Outside, the Texas evening was cooling towards something almost bearable. Inside, for the first time in 4 months, there was the sound of people eating together. William Carter looked at the table, at the men eating, at the light from the kitchen lamp. He looked down at his food. He picked up his fork again. And for the first time since February, he didn't feel like he was just taking in fuel. He felt quietly, and without quite knowing what to do with it, like he was sitting down to a meal. After the ranch hands had gone and the kitchen was clean, she had insisted on cleaning it herself because she needed to know where everything lived. Charlotte stood on the back porch and let the night air come at her. The stars in Westsas were something else. You forgot living in town that this many stars existed. They pressed down close and thick and cold white against the black sky and made the whole land feel enormous and old. She heard the door behind her. William came out and stood at the other end of the porch, a coffee cup in his hand. They were quiet for a while. "The kitchen garden," Charlotte said. "The one that's gone to weeds." "Yes. I'll start on it tomorrow. It's late in the season, but there's time for a few things still." "All right. And the hinge on the front door needs tending. One of your ranch hands can fix it if you ask." "I'll ask." She looked at the stars. "William." "Charlotte. I want to say something, and I want to say it plainly, and I want us to have it said so we don't have to say it again." He turned slightly to look at her. "I am not the woman this town thinks I am," she said. "I'm not simple, and I'm not slow, and I'm not fragile, and I don't need to be managed or handled or protected from opinions. I've already heard 1,000 times, I'm good at my work. I'm honest in my dealings, and I'll give this household everything I have. What I ask in return is to be treated like a person who earns her place through the quality of her work, and not through the size of her dress, or the approval of people who decided about me before I opened my mouth. The silence after this was not uncomfortable. William looked at her for a moment. "That's a fair thing to ask," he said. "It is," she agreed. He looked back at the stars. "I don't make judgments based on what Dust Creek thinks about a person," he said. "I've got my own opinions about what Dust Creek thinks about a person." "And what's that?" "That they're usually wrong about what matters," he said. "And usually right about nothing important." Charlotte looked at the stars. "Good," she said. "Then we understand each other." "I reckon we do," he said. They stood in the Texas night. Two people who had both arrived at this porch from very different kinds of loneliness, watching the same stars, and didn't say anything else for a long while. And somewhere in the silence between them, something began. Not love, not yet. Just the first careful, fragile recognition that this specific place, this specific evening, this specific moment of quiet between two people who had both been in their separate ways alone for too long might be the beginning of something that neither of them had allowed themselves to expect anymore. The night was warm. The stars were close. And for the first time in as long as she could remember, Charlotte Hayes was not standing outside a closed door. The next morning came at 4:30. Charlotte was already up. She had been awake since 4, lying in the narrow bed in the back room, listening to the sounds of the ranch, settle and shift in the pre-dawn, the cattle moving in the far pasture, a horse stamping in the barn, the creak of the old house adjusting to the drop in temperature the way old houses did. She lay there for 30 minutes, thinking about provisions, about the kitchen garden, about the dried apple supply in the cellar, and whether there was enough sugar to justify making another pie before the week was out. Then she got up, braided her hair, put on her dress, and went to work. By the time William came through the kitchen at 5:15, there was coffee on the stove, biscuits in the oven, and Charlotte was standing at the work table with a sheet of paper and a pencil writing a list. He stopped in the doorway. He looked at the coffee. He looked at the biscuits. He looked at her already dressed and organized, and clearly several steps into a day he hadn't even started yet. "You don't have to start this early," he said. "Your ranch hands are up at 5, she said without looking up from her list. "If I want breakfast on the table when they need it, I start at 4:30. She made another notation. "Sit down, William. Coffee's ready." He sat. She poured without being asked, set the cup in front of him, and went back to her list. He watched her for a moment. "What are you writing?" he asked. "A provisions list. What I need from town and what I can source from the property. You're short on several things." She turned the paper toward him. "Salt, baking powder, dried beans, you've got some but not enough for winter stores. I'll need pickling vinegar. Lard. And the kitchen garden will give us tomatoes and peppers if I start on it today, maybe green beans late but possible. Do you have a man who can spare an hour for the weeding?" William looked at the list. "I'll ask Hector," he said. "He's good with plants." "Good." She took the paper back and kept writing. He drank his coffee. He watched her move around the kitchen with the particular efficiency of someone who had mapped the space in a single day and already owned it, the way competent people own spaces, not with drama, but with the certainty of someone who knows where everything belongs and has opinions about the things that don't. "Charlotte," he said. You slept all right." She glanced at him. "Brief." "Fine," she said. Which was not entirely true. She had lain awake longer than she'd admitted to herself in the unfamiliar room in the unfamiliar house, running through the week's events with the quiet thoroughness of someone who didn't have the luxury of not thinking things through. 7 doors. William Carter and his steady gaze from across the street. Pauline Driscoll's voice through the wall. The wagon ride north, the stars from the back porch. That's a fair thing to ask. He'd said it simply and meant it plainly, and that was the thing she kept returning to. Not because it was remarkable that a man should treat her decently. It should not have been remarkable. But after 3 days of Dust Creek, Texas, it felt like water in a drought. She did not say any of this, She said fine, and went back to her list. The biscuits came out of the oven. William picked one up immediately, burned his fingers slightly, and ate it anyway. "Good Lord," he said quietly, which was not precisely a sentence, but communicated everything necessary. Charlotte permitted herself a small private smile aimed at her provisions list. The ranch hands arrived at 5:30. Charlie Briggs came in first, as he always did, and stopped when he saw the table already set, coffee, already made biscuits in a basket in the center. "Morning, Miss Charlotte," he said. It was the first time any of them had used her name. She registered it, tucked it away. "Morning, Charlie. Sit down." Pete, the youngest, came in behind him, still pulling on his suspenders, and his eyes went to the biscuit basket with the unguarded joy of a 17-year-old boy who had been eating badly for months. "Those are for everyone," Charlotte said before he could reach for one with the furtive speed of someone accustomed to competition. He grinned. "Yes, ma'am." The other two, a quiet Mexican vaquero named Hector, who moved like someone comfortable in his own skin, and a lean, taciturn man named Davis, who had so far said fewer than 20 words in her presence, took their seats and ate with the focused, grateful silence of men receiving something they hadn't expected. Charlotte stood at the stove and ate her own breakfast, standing, which was what she always did, and no one commented on it. It was, she thought, a reasonable beginning. Chang. The kitchen garden took 3 days. Hector turned out to be as good with plants as William had said, and he didn't talk while he worked, which Charlotte appreciated. They pulled weeds in companionable silence. On the first morning, Hector methodical and thorough, Charlotte ruthless about root systems. By the second day, they had cleared enough ground to see what was salvageable, which was more than she'd hoped. The tomato plants were struggling, but alive. The pepper plants had survived entirely, apparently too stubborn to quit. Green beans were a possibility if she got seeds in immediately. "You know plants," Hector said on the second afternoon. It wasn't a question. "Children's Home had a kitchen garden," Charlotte said. 12 girls feeding 60 people. You learn fast." Hector nodded. He understood the logic of feeding many people from modest resources. "The tomatoes will make it," he said. "They are stubborn like you." Charlotte looked at him. He didn't smile, but there was something in his eyes that was close. "Thank you," she said. She meant it for the tomatoes, and for the other thing too. By the third day, the garden was producing a visible future. She had seeds in a proper watering schedule established, and the first ripe tomatoes picked and sitting in a bowl on the kitchen work table, like something to be proud of. She made a tomato gravy for supper that evening. Charlie Briggs said, "Miss Charlotte, I don't know where you came from, but I'm glad you got here." And Davis, who had said perhaps 30 total words in her presence since her arrival, looked up from his plate and said, "This is real good," and went back to eating. It was not effusive praise. Charlotte thought it was the best thing she'd heard since Abilene. What she had not anticipated was William Carter. She had anticipated the work she was good at. The work had been good at it for 6 years, and it held no mysteries for her. She had anticipated the adjustment of learning a new household, new preferences, new rhythms. She had even anticipated in a guarded, realistic way that there would be a period of scrutiny, of being watched to see whether she measured up, and she had prepared herself for that with the same quiet steadiness she brought to everything. She had not anticipated a man who came home each evening and sat at the kitchen table and talked, not constantly, not in the way of someone who was performing conversation or filling silence, because silence made him uncomfortable. William Carter was, she quickly understood, fundamentally comfortable with silence. He could go hours without speaking, would sit through an entire meal with nothing more than, "Pass the salt, please," and a nod, and it was never unfriendly, just honest. He spoke when he had something to say. The thing was that he seemed gradually to have something to say to her. It started small. "Hector says the peppers are going to be good this year." "They will be," she said. "I'm thinking to preserve some for winter. You have canning jars." "In the cellar, somewhere. I'll find them." Then the next evening, "Pete burned himself on the fence wire today. I patched him up, but he wasn't happy about it." "I have proper salve in my kit," she said. "Send him to me tomorrow morning. He'll complain." "That's fine. He can complain while I put the salve on." William looked at her with an expression that was close to amusement. Fair enough. Then gradually longer. He had opinions about cattle that she found interesting, despite knowing almost nothing about cattle. Not because the subject was inherently fascinating to her, but because of the way he talked about it, with a direct, unsentimental understanding of living things that she recognized and respected. He talked about his cattle the way she talked about her garden. Not with sentimentality, but with a kind of honest care, knowing their habits, their tendencies, which ones were trouble and which ones were steady. I had been ranching since he was 14, he told her one evening. Started with his father on this same end, learned everything he knew from watching and from failing and from starting again. Your father, she asked. He's gone 10 years, he said. Heart, they thought. She thought about the thing he'd said on the first wagon ride. My mother. She passed in February. An only child then, or close to it. This house that had held a family thinning out over 10 years into something with one person in it. Who ran the house after your father passed? She asked. Your mother alone. Yes. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. She was a capable woman. Not easy exactly, but capable. A pause. She had opinions about how a kitchen should be run. I imagine she'd have opinions about my kitchen. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. She'd have told you the biscuits needed more salt. She'd have been wrong, Charlotte said. William looked at her. Then he laughed. It was the first time she'd heard him laugh. Brief, genuine, unguarded the laugh of a man who hadn't expected it and didn't have time to decide whether to let it out before it was already out. Charlotte kept her expression neutral and took a sip of her own coffee. But something settled in her in that moment. Something small and careful that she did not name. 3 weeks in the first trouble came from town. She had known it would. She'd been waiting for it with the patient, resigned awareness of someone who has learned that certain things are inevitable, like weather and human nature. It arrived in the form of Agnes Whitmore. Agnes Whitmore was 38 years old, the widow of a successful landowner who had left her comfortable and opinionated with a sharp face and sharper tongue, and a social position in Dust Creek that she spent considerable energy maintaining. She drove out to Mountain View Ranch on a Thursday morning in her good buggy with her good dress on, and when Charlotte opened the front door, Agnes looked her up and down with the smooth, practiced assessment of a woman who has made this particular calculation many times before. You must be the new girl, Agnes said. Charlotte Hayes, Charlotte said. Can I help you, ma'am? I'm here to see William. Agnes stepped forward in a way that presumed she would be let in, and Charlotte, who recognized the move, stepped aside because arguing with it in the doorway was not worth the energy. Agnes moved through the front room with the particular quality of a woman taking inventory. William's in the north pasture, Charlotte said. I'm not certain when he'll be back. Can I give him a message? Agnes turned. How are you finding it here? She asked. The question had a shape to it, a precision that was not really curiosity. It's good work, Charlotte said. I imagine it must be. Agnes looked at the room again. At the fresh curtains Charlotte had washed and rehung the swept floor, the bowl of tomatoes on the sideboard. You've made yourself quite comfortable. I've been doing my job, ma'am. Of course. Agnes smiled. It didn't reach her eyes by any measurement. I've known William for many years, since before his father passed. He's a good man, steady, private. She paused precisely long enough for the next sentence to land with maximum weight. He has a tendency to be generous to people who need help, even when it might not be in his best interest. Charlotte looked at her. I'm not sure I take your meaning, Mrs. Whitmore, she said, which was a lie. She took her meaning exactly. Agnes gave her another version of the smile. I'm sure you don't. She pulled on her gloves. Tell William I called. He knows where to find me. She left. Charlotte stood in the front room for a moment after the buggy disappeared. Then she went back to the kitchen and began straining the tomatoes she'd been cooking down for preserving. She strained them very thoroughly. She did not think about Agnes Whitmore, whom she had understood within 30 seconds of meeting her. She thought instead about yield, how many jars, whether to add more pepper than the previous batch, whether the seals she had were still good. She thought about those things, and only those things. but her hands pressing the tomatoes through the sieve were slightly less gentle than usual. That evening, when the ranch hands had eaten and gone, and William was sitting at the table with his coffee, Charlotte said without preamble, "Agnes Whitmore called this morning." William was quiet for exactly 1 second. "I see," he said. "She was pleasant enough," Charlotte said carefully. "She left a message that she'd called, and you knew where to find her." Another pause. "Did she say anything else?" Charlotte looked at him. He was looking at his coffee. "She told me you had a tendency toward generosity that wasn't always in your best interest," Charlotte said. She said it pleasantly. William's jaw tightened slightly. "I expect she did." "What is she to you?" Charlotte asked. Because she was a practical woman, and practical women asked direct questions rather than spending weeks in speculation. William looked up. "A neighbor," he said. "Nothing more. Whatever she's told herself to the contrary." Charlotte nodded, filed it. "All right. She'll come back," he said. "She comes back." "I expect she will." "She's going to make things complicated," he said. It wasn't an apology. It was a statement of fact delivered with the honesty she'd come to recognize as his particular idiom. "Mrs. Whitmore," Charlotte said, picking up her cup, "is not the first complicated thing I have navigated. She won't be the last." She drank. "Are the tomatoes good in this coffee? I've been worried the kitchen smells too strongly from the preserving." William blinked at the change of subject. "The coffee's fine," he said. "Good," she said. But she watched him after that. Watched in the way she'd learned to watch people quietly without making them aware they were being observed for the thing beneath the surface. William Carter was a man who managed his face very carefully. He did not broadcast. He did not perform. When something touched him, you saw it only in the small things, the extra stillness, the slight tightening of a muscle in his jaw, the way his hands shifted on whatever he was holding. I was bothered by Agnes Whitmore, in a way that had nothing to do with romantic feelings, she thought. He was bothered in the way of a man who had been maneuvered before and recognized the approach of being maneuvered again. She filed that too. And she thought about the word generous. Agnes had said it like an accusation, like a weakness. Like William's willingness to offer Charlotte a job was evidence of a flaw to be managed. Charlotte thought about what it meant that a woman of Agnes Whitmore's particular intelligence had said exactly that word. And then she thought about something else. She thought about the fact that William Carter in 3 weeks had not once, looked at her the way the people of Dust Creek looked at her. Had not made a single comment, direct or indirect, about her size or her appearance, or the particular quality of her presence in his house. Had not made a single gesture that suggested she was anything other than exactly what she was, the person he had hired, because she was the best person available for the job, who was doing the job well. She thought about what it cost a person to be that straightforwardly decent. What it cost in a town like Dust Creek. What it was going to cost him specifically as Agnes Whitmore and Pauline Driscoll and the machinery of small-town opinion continued its work. She thought about whether she should feel guilty about that. She decided she was not going to. A woman who had been turned away from 7 doors did not have the luxury of feeling guilty about the one that opened. It was Pete who told her about the talk in town. He didn't mean to. He was 17 and guileless in the way of very young people who haven't yet learned to regulate the gap between what they know and what they say. He was sitting at the kitchen table on a Saturday afternoon while Charlotte put the salve on his burned hand. He'd had another encounter with fence wire, and he was talking in the unfocused associative way of a boy who was comfortable and therefore not careful. "Charlie says some people in town are talking about the ranch," he said. Charlotte kept her attention on his hand. "What kind of talking?" "Saying you're—" He stopped, looked at his hand. "I don't know, saying things." "Pete," she said not unkindly. "You can tell me." I was quiet for a moment. "Saying you trapped Mr. Carter. That you knew he was rich and you got yourself hired on purpose so you could—" He stopped again. "It's stupid," he said with sudden conviction. "It's really stupid." Charlotte kept wrapping the bandage. Her hands were steady. "It is stupid," she agreed. "You work harder than anyone on this ranch. I've seen you. You're up before everyone, and you don't stop until it's dark." He looked up at her with the earnest indignation of youth. "How is that trapping someone?" "It's not," she said. She tied off the bandage. "People tell stories, Pete. Sometimes the stories are about the work, and sometimes they're about other things. You learn to figure out which is which, and you keep your head down and do your job." "But it ain't right." "No," she agreed. "It ain't." She sent him back to the bunkhouse. She stood in the kitchen for a moment. Then she walked to the back porch and stood in the afternoon heat and looked at the kitchen garden, which was now producing steadily the tomatoes, dark red and heavy, the peppers pushing green into yellow, the beans coming along. She had built this. In 3 weeks, she had built this from a weedy ruin into something that was giving back. That was real. That was not a story anyone could change by talking about it. She straightened up and went back inside to start supper. The twist came on a Thursday evening 4 weeks in, and it came in the form of a letter. Charlie Briggs brought it out from town when he went in for supplies. He handed it to William at the supper table without ceremony. A sealed envelope town postmark addressed in a hand Charlotte didn't recognize. William looked at it. His expression shifted in the way she'd learned to read the slight tightening, the extra stillness. He didn't open it at the table. He put it in his jacket pocket and ate his supper and talked with the ranch hands about the north fence line and the prospect of rain by the weekend. And the letter sat in his pocket, and Charlotte watched him in her peripheral vision the whole time. After supper, when everyone had gone, she was washing plates when she heard him unfold the envelope in the room behind her. She kept washing. The silence went on. "Charlotte," he said. She dried her hands and turned around. I was standing with the letter held flat in both hands, looking at it with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not quite anger, not quite resignation. Something in between with something else underneath that she couldn't entirely read. He held it out. She crossed the kitchen and took it. It was from the Dust Creek Civic Committee. 6 signatures at the bottom, Pauline Driscoll's among them. The language was formal and careful, the particular formality of people who want to be cruel while maintaining deniability. And it concerned, as it stated in the opening line, a matter of community standards and the well-being of a respected member of their town. It concerned specifically the continued employment of Charlotte Hayes at Mountain View Ranch, and whether such an arrangement was appropriate, and what it communicated to the families of Dust Creek about the values of one of its more prominent citizens. It was 3 paragraphs long. It suggested in its final paragraph that William might want to reconsider his current staffing arrangements in the interest of his reputation and standing in the community. Charlotte read it twice. Then she folded it carefully along its original creases and placed it back on the table. She said nothing for a moment. "I see," she said finally. "Charlotte, no." She looked at him. Her voice was very level, very clean. "Listen to me. I want you to know something, and I want you to believe me when I say it." She kept his eyes. "If you need to let me go, if this letter says the true thing about what my being here costs you, I will pack my things tonight. I won't make it complicated. I won't cause you difficulty. I will simply go." William looked at her for a long moment. "Is that what you want?" he said. "What I want," Charlotte said, "is not the point." "It is to me," he said. The kitchen was very quiet. Charlotte looked at the folded letter on the table between them. "What it costs me," William said slowly, with the particular care of a man choosing words, because he means them precisely, "is not the measure I use." He picked up the letter. He looked at it once more. Then he walked to the iron range and opened the firebox door and put the letter in and closed the door again. The paper caught quickly. She could hear it. He turned around. "You made this house feel like a home again in 4 weeks," he said. "My mother built this kitchen garden. I let it die. You brought it back." He stopped. "Pauline Driscoll has never done one thing for this ranch in her life, and I don't reckon she's about to start." Charlotte said nothing. "I'm not letting you go," he said. "Unless you want to go, and I'm hoping you don't want to go." Something moved in her chest. Something she pressed down immediately and firmly, because this was not the moment for it, and she was a practical woman. "The beans will be ready to pick in 2 days," she said. I'll need help with the canning." His mouth did that thing, the almost smile. "I'll ask Hector," he said. "Good," she said. She turned back to the dishes, but her hands in the water were shaking slightly, and she was glad her back was to him, and she was glad the letter was ash, and she was more glad than she had been about anything in a long time that she was still standing in this kitchen. The evening after that changed between them. Not dramatically, not with speeches or declarations or anything that could be pointed to and named. It was smaller than that, subtler. They stayed at the table longer after supper. An extra half-hour at first, then an hour. Talking about the ranch, about his mother's preserving recipes that she'd found in a tin box in the pantry, about the weather and the cattle and the state of the road to town. Normal things. The kinds of things two people talked about when they were becoming gradually something more than an employer and an employee sitting in the same kitchen. One evening she told him about the children's home. Not the sad version she'd carried in her chest for years like a weight, but the actual version, the 12 girls, the kitchen garden, the chaos of 60 people, and never enough of anything, and the particular satisfaction which she had discovered very young of turning limited resources into something real and good and nourishing. She told it the way she told most things, directly, without self-pity, with occasional dry humor about the parts that were genuinely funny in retrospect. William listened, the way he listened to everything, with his full attention, without interrupting, without filling silences she was still working through. When she finished, he said, "You've been feeding people since you were a child." "I have." "Do you ever get tired of it?" She thought about this seriously. "No," she said. "I get tired of doing it for people who don't notice. That's different." He looked at her. "I notice," he said. She held his gaze for exactly one beat longer than she meant to. Then she looked down at her cup. "Good," she said. And the fire in the range burned low, and the night settled around the ranch, and two people sat at a kitchen table in West Texas with the careful, fragile awareness of something neither of them knew yet quite how to name, only that it was there, growing the way things grew in patient, stubborn ground, steady and quiet and entirely real. Outside, the stars were close. Inside, someone had remembered to tend the fire. And it was warm. The second letter arrived on a Monday. Charlotte found it herself this time, slipped under the front door sometime before dawn, which meant whoever had delivered it had come out 4 miles from town in the dark, specifically to do so. That level of effort told her something about the seriousness of what was coming that the words themselves hadn't yet said. She picked it up off the floor and looked at it for a moment without opening it. Then she set it on the kitchen table next to William's coffee cup and went to start breakfast. When William came through at 5:15, he saw it immediately. She watched him see it, the slight pause in his movement, the way his hand slowed, reaching for the coffee she'd already poured. He picked up the envelope, looked at the front. Then he looked at her. "You read it?" he asked. "It's addressed to you," she said. He opened it. She kept her back to him and turned the biscuits in the oven. She listened to the quality of the silence behind her, which told her things. The silence stretched. She heard him put the paper down on the table. She heard him pick it up again. "Charlotte," he said. She turned. His face was doing the thing she'd learned to read, the stillness that was not calm, the jaw that was not relaxed. But there was something else this time. Something she hadn't seen in him before, and she looked at it for a moment, trying to name it. It was anger. Real anger. Not the managed, contained version he usually kept. This was the kind that lived underneath everything else, and came up when something crossed a line that a man had privately decided was the line. "What does it say?" she asked. He turned the letter and set it on the work table facing her. She read it. It was from Agnes Whitmore. Not the civic committee this time, Agnes directly in her own handwriting, in a hand that was elegant and deliberate, and chose every word the way a woman chose a weapon. It was longer than the committee letter, more personal. It cited specifically Charlotte's background, orphaned, no family, no standing, and her physical appearance described in language that was clinical and contemptuous in equal measure. It suggested that William was being manipulated by a woman who had nothing to lose and everything to gain, and that his mother, were she alive, would be devastated to see what had become of her household. It ended with an invitation. Agnes was hosting a dinner on Saturday evening for the town's leading families. William was expected. He should, the letter concluded, come alone. Charlotte read it to the end. She put it down. She turned back to the oven and removed the biscuits. Charlotte. His voice was very controlled. I want you to know. I know, she said. No. He came around the work table so she had to look at him. I want to say it clearly. Agnes Whitmore does not speak for me. She does not represent my opinions, and she does not get to describe you in those terms in a letter to my house and go unanswered. Charlotte looked at him. William, she said carefully, she's not entirely wrong about one thing. He went very still. I have no family, no standing, no connections in this county. She kept her voice even because losing her evenness now would not serve her. Agnes Whitmore has all three. If she has decided to make this a problem for you, she has the tools to do it. She paused. I'm telling you this not because I think you should do what she says. I'm telling you because you should understand clearly what you are choosing. He looked at her for a long moment. I understood what I was choosing, he said, the day I crossed the street. The kitchen was very still. From outside, she could hear the ranch hands moving toward the barn. The ordinary sounds of a morning beginning. She thought about the letter on the table. She thought about Agnes Whitmore's elegant handwriting and the specific words she'd used to describe Charlotte's body, and she thought about how a woman could read those words and feel them land and still stand upright and look directly at the man across the work table. She thought, I have survived worse than Agnes Whitmore. Burn it, she said. He picked it up and burned it. Good, she said. Breakfast is ready. But it didn't end with the letter. The following Wednesday, Charlotte went into Dust Creek for supplies. She went alone. William had offered to come, and she had told him that she was not a woman who needed an escort to a general store, and he had looked at her for a moment and then said, all right, because he knew her well enough by now to know when she meant something precisely. She went in on the supply wagon with Hector, who was going for ranch equipment, and who asked no questions and made no commentary, which she appreciated. McCrady's was half full when she walked in. A Wednesday morning in early fall, women shopping, a few men waiting on deliveries. The conversation did not stop when she entered. But it changed. She felt the change the way you feel a drop in temperature, not dramatic, just a shift. A cooling. She gathered her list. Flour, baking powder, salt, pickling jars. She moved through the store, efficiently placed her items on the counter, and waited for Roy McCrady to total them. Roy McCrady was a mild man, not unkind, who made it his business to have no opinions about his customers. He totaled her order without incident. It was when he was wrapping the jars that Pauline Driscoll appeared at her left shoulder. Charlotte did not turn immediately. She finished counting out her money on the counter. Then she turned. Pauline was not alone. Ruth Ackerman was beside her, looking uncomfortable in the way she usually looked around Pauline, like a woman who had signed up for something and was regularly surprised by what it required of her. And behind Ruth, slightly, was a woman Charlotte hadn't seen before. 40 perhaps. Beautiful in a cool, composed way. Dressed well. Standing with the particular posture of a person who was used to being the most significant presence in any room. Agnes Whitmore. So this was the in-person version. Charlotte met her eyes. Miss Hayes, Pauline said. She used the voice she reserved for announcements. I'm glad we ran into you. Mrs. Driscoll, Charlotte said. We were hoping to have a word. Pauline glanced at Agnes, who had not moved, and was still watching Charlotte with that cool, measuring regard. We're concerned, as a community. About what? Charlotte said. About you, Pauline said, with the particular emphasis that meant about your presence, about your existence in our town, about the fact of you. Your situation at Mountain View Ranch has people talking. We think for your own sake. For my own sake, Charlotte repeated. Pauline's chin went up. William Carter is a respected man. He has a place in this community. What you're doing. What am I doing, Mrs. Driscoll? Charlotte said. Her voice was perfectly level, not raised, not shaking. She had spent 24 years developing a voice that could stay level under pressure, and she deployed it now with the precision of a skilled tool. Pauline blinked. She was not accustomed to the question being turned back. "You're placing him in a difficult position," Agnes Whitmore said. Her voice was exactly what the letter had suggested: smooth, deliberate, the kind of voice that had always been listened to and knew it. Charlotte turned to look at her directly. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said, "I cook for the man. I run his household. I tend his garden, and I manage his provisions, and I keep his ranch hands fed." She paused. "What position exactly does that place him in?" Agnes smiled. It was practiced. A compromising one. "He hired help," Charlotte said. "That compromises a man's position in Dust Creek." "You know what I mean," Agnes said. "I do," Charlotte said. "And I'll tell you what I know about it. Whatever story you've decided to tell about me and Mountain View Ranch, whatever you've been telling each other in this store and at your dinner tables, it has nothing to do with William Carter's position in this community, and everything to do with yours, Mrs. Whitmore. Yours specifically." The temperature in McCready's general store dropped several degrees. Pauline made a sound. Agnes Whitmore's eyes sharpened. "Be very careful," Agnes said quietly. "I'm always careful," Charlotte said. "I've had to be." She picked up her wrapped packages from the counter. "I have work to get back to. Good morning to you all." She turned and walked out. She walked to the wagon where Hector was loading equipment and set her packages in the back and climbed up to the bench and sat very straight. Her heart was going at a considerable rate, but she was upright. She was whole. She had not been diminished in that store, and she knew it, and she was going to let that knowledge carry her 4 miles back to the ranch without second-guessing a single word. Hector climbed up beside her. He did not start the horse immediately. "You all right?" he said. It was not a complicated question. "Yes," she said. "Drive, please." He drove. She didn't tell William what had happened. She went back to the ranch, put away the provisions, started the afternoon's preserving, and made supper. And at the table she talked about the yield from the pepper plants and the state of the road into town, and whether the weather was turning, and she said nothing about McCready's store. She told herself it was because she didn't want to agitate something she had already handled. She told herself that for 3 days. Then Pete came back from town on a Saturday morning with the supply list and a face that was doing the thing it did when he was carrying something he wasn't sure he should say. Charlotte looked at him across the kitchen table. "What?" she said. "Nothing," Pete said. "Pete." He lasted about 4 seconds. He was 17. "People are saying." He started, then stopped, then started again. "They're saying in town that you told Agnes Whitmore off in the middle of McCready's store." He looked at her sideways. "Did you?" Charlotte turned back to the stove. "I said what needed saying." "Mrs. Whitmore's telling everyone you were rude to her." "I expect she is." "She's also telling people—" Pete stopped. Charlotte turned around and looked at him. "All of it," she said. He swallowed. "She's telling people that she's going to make sure you leave. That she's going to—" He twisted his hat in his hands. "She told the bank manager that the ranch's credit arrangement should be reviewed. That Mr. Carter's, that his judgment hasn't been sound lately." The room went quiet. Charlotte stood very still. There it was. The real weapon. Not gossip. Not social pressure. Agnes Whitmore going after William's financial standing because Charlotte had stood up to her in a general store. That was different. That changed things. "Who told you this?" she said. "Charlie heard it from Davis. Davis was in the bank when Mrs. Whitmore was talking to Mr. Holloway. He looked miserable. I thought you should know." "Yes," Charlotte said. "Thank you, Pete." She turned back to the stove. She kept her hands moving, stirring, adjusting, doing the small mechanical tasks that kept the surface of her calm. Inside, something had shifted. She had been willing to absorb what Agnes Whitmore aimed at her. She had made herself armor of 6 years of practice absorbing what people aimed at her, and she could take it, and had been taking it, and would keep taking it. That was her burden, and she had chosen long ago not to let it break her. But this was not aimed at her. This was aimed at William. And that was an entirely different calculation. She didn't say anything to William that evening. She watched him at supper talking with Charlie about cattle prices easy in his own house, in the way he'd been getting easier these past weeks. And she watched him and thought about Agnes Whitmore talking to a bank manager, and she felt something sharp and protective move through her that she hadn't expected and didn't know what to do with yet. She lay awake that night. She thought about packing her suitcase. She thought about it seriously in the practical way she thought about serious things. If she left, if she simply went quietly without drama, before Agnes Whitmore could do more damage, William's situation resolved itself. The talk stopped. The bank manager stopped getting visits. Everything Agnes was agitating went back to silence. Charlotte would lose the position. A room. A kitchen garden she'd built back from nothing. The sound of a man's unexpected laugh at a kitchen table. The particular quality of evenings that had become without her noticing. When exactly it happened, the thing she looked forward to most in a given day. She would lose those things. But William would keep his credit and his standing and his ranch. She made herself look at this option honestly, the way she made herself look at hard things honestly because she was not a woman who survived by looking away. Then she thought about what William had said the morning they burned the second letter. I understood what I was choosing the day I crossed the street. She pressed her hands flat against the mattress in the dark. She had not asked him to cross the street. She had not asked him to burn the letters. She had not asked him on any of the 37 days she had been in this house to do a single thing, except give her work and treat her like a person who earned her place through the quality of what she did. He had done more than that. He had done more than that entirely on his own, of his own choosing for his own reasons, and she had not asked him, and he had not asked her permission. Maybe she thought in the dark. In the quiet of the room she'd made her own. Maybe the question was not whether she should leave for his sake. Maybe the question was whether she had the right to decide that for him. She was still thinking about it when she fell asleep. Sunday morning was Charlotte's morning off. She kept it. She'd kept it since the first week, not because William enforced it, but because she enforced it herself. Because a woman who did not keep the things she was owed eventually stopped knowing what she was owed and started giving everything away without accounting. She sat on the back porch with coffee and looked at the garden. She heard the screen door behind her. William came out, which was unusual for a Sunday morning. He normally gave her the porch on Sundays, had started doing it without being asked, just absorbed it as part of the rhythm of the house. He appeared with his own coffee and sat in the other chair and didn't say anything immediately, which was also normal. What was not normal was the quality of the silence. Charlotte looked at him sideways. "You know," she said. It was not a question. He looked at his coffee. "Charlie told me last night about the bank." She waited. "I went to see Holloway yesterday afternoon," he said. "The bank manager." He paused. He was apologetic. "He's known me for 15 years. He said Agnes had expressed concerns. He said he didn't intend to act on them." Another pause. He was embarrassed. "Good," Charlotte said. "Charlotte, don't," she said. He looked at her. "Don't apologize for Agnes Whitmore," she said. "You didn't send the letters. You didn't go to the bank. You haven't done one thing that warrants an apology. I brought you into a situation. You offered me work," she said. "I took it. That was my choice as much as yours." She looked at the garden. The tomatoes were done for the season. She'd pulled the last of them 2 days ago, canned them all rows of jars in the cellar, like something she'd built with her hands. "I've been thinking," she said about leaving. William went very still. "Not because I want to," she said immediately. "I want you to hear that clearly. Not because I want to." She turned and looked at him directly. "But I've been thinking that my being here is costing you things I didn't agree to cost you when I took this position. And I thought you should know that I've been thinking about it, and that I'm not sure what the right thing is." He set his coffee cup down on the porch railing. "Can I tell you something?" he said. "Yes." He looked out at the garden, the way he looked at things he was deciding how to say. "When my mother was alive, this house had a sound to it. You wouldn't think a house could have a sound, but it did. The kitchen being used, the garden being tended, somebody moving around in the morning before I was up. He paused. When she died, the sound stopped. I noticed it every day. I worked more. I went to bed later. I stopped sitting on this porch because sitting on this porch in the quiet felt like... He stopped. It felt like the wrong kind of alone. Charlotte said nothing. You've been here 37 days, he said. And this house has a sound again. The kitchen sounds like a kitchen. The garden looks like a garden. I sit on this porch in the evenings, and it doesn't feel wrong anymore. He looked at her. I'm not saying this to obligate you. I'm saying it so you know what you've given back to this place, and so that when you weigh whether to leave, you weigh that too. Charlotte held his gaze. She felt something move through her that was not practical, not manageable, not the kind of thing she could file away and address later. It moved through her clean and clear, and it was the specific feeling of being seen, not assessed, not evaluated, not found wanting or found sufficient, just seen, and it was the most disorienting thing she had felt in a very long time. William, she said. Yes, I'm not leaving. She said it simply. I want that to be clear. I was thinking about it because I thought it might be right for you. But you just told me what you need me to know, and I'm not leaving. He looked at her for a moment. Good, he said. But we need to do something about Agnes Whitmore. He picked his coffee back up. I've been thinking about that. She's not going to stop, Charlotte said. Not because she loves you, or because she wants what's best for you. She's going to keep going because I embarrassed her in McCready's store, and she's not accustomed to that, and she has decided I need to be removed from the situation. She paused. I'm not wrong. You're not wrong, he said. So what are we going to do? He was quiet for a moment. There's a church social next Saturday, he said. First Presbyterian. Whole town turns out. Charlotte looked at him. And I think we should go. The silence that followed was significant. Charlotte understood what he was saying. Not I will attend the social. Not you should consider attending the social. We. Together. In public. In front of all of Dust Creek's leading families, all of Agnes Whitmore's social architecture, all of Pauline Driscoll's opinion machinery. That will make things considerably more complicated, she said carefully. Yes, he said. It will. People will say things. They already do. They'll say them to your face. Then I'll answer them to their faces. He looked at her with the direct, steady regard she'd come to recognize as the truest version of him, the one underneath all the quiet and the economy of words and the careful management of what he showed. I've been letting this town make decisions about my household and my choices for 2 months. I'm done with that. Charlotte looked at her coffee. She thought about standing in McCready's store. She thought about Agnes Whitmore's elegant, contemptuous handwriting. She thought about 7 doors closing in 3 days, and the particular sound a door made when someone shut it on you. Not a slam, because the people of Dust Creek were too careful for that, but a firm, definitive click that said, not here, not you, not ever. She thought about 1 door opening. All right, she said. All right, William. She looked at him. We'll go to the social. She spent the week quietly dreading it and refusing to show that she was quietly dreading it. She made meals. She tended the last of the garden. She began the winter preserving in earnest, working through the cellar inventory with systematic thoroughness, and she let the physical work of her hands keep the rest of her organized. On Thursday evening, Charlie Briggs stopped her in the kitchen after supper. How was a man of few speeches, Charlie? He'd been on this ranch for 12 years, and he communicated mostly in nods and short declarative sentences. So when he stopped her in the kitchen with his hat in his hands and said, Miss Charlotte, I want to say something, she paid attention. Say it, Charlie, she said. What they've been doing to you in town, he said. He stopped, started again. I've got a sister, back in Missouri. Good woman. Harder worker than me always was. People gave her a particular kind of difficulty her whole life that she didn't deserve and couldn't change. He looked at his hat. I know what it looks like. I recognized it the first day you came here." He looked up. "What Mr. Carter's doing Saturday taking you to that social? It's the right thing. I want you to know the boys, and I think so." Charlotte looked at this weathered, laconic man standing in her kitchen with his hat in his hands, making a speech that was probably the longest he'd given in a year. "Thank you, Charlie," she said. "That means something." "Yes, ma'am," he said. He put his hat back on. "You made good biscuits this morning." "I'll make them again tomorrow," she said. He nodded and went out. Charlotte stood alone in the kitchen for a moment. Then she went back to the preserving jars, and her eyes were bright, and she blinked twice, and that was that. The first Presbyterian church social was held on a Saturday evening in the churchyard, which was strung with lanterns and crowded with every family in Dust Creek and the surrounding county who considered themselves someone. Tables of food, a fiddle player at one end, children running between adult legs. The particular quality of a community gathering that was partly celebration and partly performance, and everybody knew it. Charlotte wore her good dress. Blue, neatly pressed, fitted well. She had spent 20 minutes on her hair in the morning. Not for Dust Creek's benefit, she told herself, but because she was not going to give anyone anything to say about the way she presented herself. Her boots were clean. Her back was straight. William wore a good jacket and his better hat. He drove them in the wagon, and when they arrived he came around to her side without being asked, and offered his hand to help her down, and she took it, because it was offered plainly, and accepting a hand was not a statement. They walked into the social together. The effect on the assembled company was, she had to admit, impressive in its completeness. The nearest conversations stopped. Faces turned. A ripple moved outward from their entry point like a stone dropped in still water. William did not appear to notice any of it. He walked to the food tables, collected 2 plates, handed her one, and said, "The biscuits here won't be as good as yours." "Obviously not," she said. The nearest woman, Susan Alcott, whose door Charlotte had knocked on in week 1, looked between them with an expression of complete social bewilderment, and then turned back to her companion and began speaking in a low, rapid voice. Charlotte ate a biscuit. It was fine. She'd had worse. The first 15 minutes were a kind of siege by proxy. Everyone watching, no one approaching directly. William moved through the crowd with his usual calm, greeting people he knew, shaking hands, and Charlotte moved beside him and nodded and said good evening to the people who acknowledged her and did not acknowledge the ones who deliberately didn't. Then Agnes Whitmore appeared. She came from the direction of the church steps, where she'd been holding court, and she moved toward them with the composed directness of a woman who had been waiting for this exact moment and had prepared for it extensively. She stopped in front of William. She did not look at Charlotte. "William." Her voice was warm, calibrated, pitched for the people around them who were definitely listening. "I'm so glad you came." She placed her hand briefly on his arm. "I hoped we could talk." "Agnes," William said. He stepped back slightly, just slightly, but enough that her hand fell. "You know Charlotte." The pause was very small. Agnes turned to Charlotte. The look lasted 1 second. It communicated in that second everything Agnes had ever decided about her, and then it became deliberately, perfectly blank. Social. Correct. "Miss Hayes," she said. "Mrs. Whitmore," Charlotte said. "I hope you're finding the county air agreeable," Agnes said. "Exquisitely." "I am," Charlotte said. "The garden at Mountain View has done particularly well this fall. The tomatoes were exceptional." Agnes blinked once. "How nice," she said. "William's mother planted that garden originally," Charlotte said. "I found her recipes in the pantry. I've been using them for the preserving." She looked at Agnes with an expression of perfect pleasantness. She was clearly a remarkable woman. The color that moved through Agnes Whitmore's face was brief but real. Charlotte kept her expression pleasant and open. William looked at Charlotte sideways. She could not read his expression precisely, but she thought there was underneath everything else something that was almost admiring. Agnes gathered herself in the way of a woman who had extensive practice at gathering herself. "Enjoy the social," she said, and moved away. William waited until she was out of earshot. "Exceptional tomatoes," he said. They were, Charlotte said. We have 43 jars in the cellar. Would you like me to count them in front of her next time? A sound came out of William Carter that was unambiguously a laugh. It was not a short laugh this time. Not the brief surprised version from the kitchen weeks ago. It was a real one, full and warm, and several people nearby turned to look because William Carter did not laugh at social events or anywhere else as a matter of general record. He caught it and brought it back under control, but it took a moment. "Charlotte," he said. "Yes. You are the most." He stopped, shook his head slightly. "Thank you for coming tonight." She looked at him. "Thank you for asking me." What happened next was not dramatic in the way of books. There was no single confrontation, no moment where the assembled town of Dust Creek experienced a mass conversion. Social change was slower than that, and Charlotte had never believed otherwise. But things happened. Reverend Aldridge's letter, the one no one in Dust Creek had wanted to read, had apparently made its way through Hector's connections in the Mexican community on the south side of town, to a woman named Dolores Vega, who ran the boarding house and who had her own opinions about who was and wasn't worth knowing. Dolores Vega came to find Charlotte near the food tables midway through the evening and said without preamble, "You're the woman Thomas Aldridge recommended. I know Thomas. He doesn't recommend people easily." "No," Charlotte said. "He doesn't." "I need help at the boarding house on Thursdays," Dolores said. "Cooking. I hear you're good." "I work for William Carter," Charlotte said. "I can't take other work without his agreement." "Ask him," Dolores said. Charlotte asked him, standing there at the social in front of people. William said, "If you want to, it's your Thursday to do with." Dolores put out her hand. Charlotte shook it. 3 women standing within earshot watched this transaction and then began talking to each other in low, recalibrated voices. Pauline Driscoll from across the yard observed the handshake with an expression Charlotte could not fully read from the distance, but which contained somewhere in it the first faint shadow of something that was not certainty, and Agnes Whitmore, standing by the church steps, watched. William Carter laughed, watched his face open in a way she had been trying through 2 letters and a conversation with a bank manager to make happen for herself, and she looked at Charlotte Hayes, who had apparently accomplished what she could not, and something moved through her expression that was not anger exactly. It was something worse. It was understanding. Charlotte saw it. She did not feel triumph. She felt something quieter and more complicated, the particular feeling of a woman who has won something that cost her, and who knows the cost and does not pretend otherwise. The fiddle player struck up a reel at the far end of the yard. William appeared at her shoulder. "Do you dance?" he said. She turned and looked at him. "Do you?" she said. "Badly," he said. "But it's a reel. Nobody's watching the footwork." "Everyone is watching everything," she said. "Let them," he said. And he offered her his hand, openly, in front of all of Dust Creek, in front of Agnes Whitmore, and Pauline Driscoll, and Susan Alcott, and Dolores Vega, and every watching eye in the First Presbyterian churchyard. Charlotte Hayes looked at his hand. She looked at his face. She thought about a morning 6 weeks ago. A leather suitcase in the dirt. 7 closed doors, and a man who had crossed a street for no reason, except that he was tired of watching. She took his hand, and they walked toward the music. The morning after the social, Charlotte woke before 4 and lay still in the dark for a full 10 minutes, which was unusual for her. She was thinking about his hand, not in the way she would have permitted herself to think about it the night before, when she'd needed all her concentration for other things, for Agnes Whitmore's face, and Pauline Driscoll's eyes, and the particular quality of being watched by an entire town while a fiddle played and a man offered his hand in public, and she took it. She hadn't let herself think about the hand itself then. She'd been too busy managing everything around it. Now in the dark and the quiet, she let herself think about it. It was a working man's hand, calloused and wide and warm. He had taken her hand the way he did most things, directly without performance, and once he had it, he held it without uncertainty, as if having made a decision, he had no intention of revisiting. They had danced 2 reels, which were social dances, and therefore technically appropriate, and then stood together at the edge of the yard, while the music went slower, and he had not released her hand, and she had not suggested he should. She lay in the dark and held that memory very carefully, and then she set it aside because she was a practical woman, and practical women did not build structures on ground they hadn't surveyed. She got up, braided her hair, went to start the coffee. William came through the kitchen at 5:15 same as always, and said morning, and sat down same as always, and she put coffee in front of him same as always. And everything was exactly as it had been for the past 6 weeks, except that it was entirely different, and they both knew it, and neither of them said so yet. "You slept?" he asked. "Fine," she said. He looked at her over his cup with the dark, steady eyes that she had stopped being able to look at for too long without feeling something move in her chest. "Charlotte," he said. "The biscuits are almost done," she said. "A beat." "All right," he said, and went back to his coffee. She turned to the oven. Her hands were perfectly steady. Inside, she was doing the very deliberate work of a woman who knows exactly what she feels and has decided that feeling it and doing something about it are two different questions that need to be addressed in the correct order. The correct order, she had decided somewhere between 4 and 5 in the morning, was wait. Watch. See what the ground does before you build on it. She was good at waiting. She had been waiting in one form or another her entire life. The change in town came slowly, and then in the way of certain changes all at once. It started with Dolores Vega. Charlotte went to the boarding house the first Thursday after the social and found a kitchen that was functional but disorganized, which was something she could address. And Dolores herself, who was sharp and competent and entirely uninterested in what anyone thought about anything, which was something Charlotte found deeply refreshing. They worked together through the morning without ceremony. Dolores cooked her own recipes. She didn't need instruction, had been feeding people her whole life, but she needed help with volume and organization and the logistics of feeding 12 boarders, 3 meals a day on a fixed budget, which was precisely the kind of problem Charlotte found satisfying. By noon, the kitchen was reorganized. By the afternoon, they had a menu planned for the week that stretched the provisions further than Dolores had managed before. Dolores stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the week's plan on the slate board. "You're good," she said simply. "Thank you," Charlotte said equally simply. "My boarders talk," Dolores said. "What they say travels. I want you to know that." Charlotte understood her meaning. Dolores Vega's boarding house was not at the social center of Dust Creek. It was south of it, slightly in the part of town where the families who weren't leading families lived and worked and talked among themselves. A different network than Agnes Whitmore's dinner parties, not less real. "Thank you," Charlotte said again. The second Thursday, Dolores introduced her to a woman named Marguerite Sullivan, who was 32 years old, broad-shouldered and red-haired and newly widowed, and who was trying to find work in Dust Creek and finding mostly closed doors. She sat at Dolores's kitchen table when Charlotte arrived and looked up with the particular expression Charlotte recognized, because she had worn it herself, the careful, defended, already expecting rejection look. Charlotte set down her bag, took off her coat, and said, "Can you cook?" Marguerite blinked. "Some." "Can you learn more?" "Yes." "Then sit there and watch what I do this morning," Charlotte said, "and ask me anything you want to know." Dolores behind her said nothing. But when Charlotte glanced back, the older woman was looking at her with an expression that was not quite a smile, but held the warmth of one. By the end of that Thursday, Marguerite Sullivan had the name of a ranch family 10 miles west who needed a housekeeper and who Dolores had already spoken to. Charlotte had written her a note of introduction that said plainly that Marguerite was capable and willing and worth hiring, and signed it, Charlotte Hayes, Mountain View Ranch. She rode back to the ranch that Thursday evening, wondering if the note would carry any weight. She found out 2 weeks later, when Marguerite appeared at the back door of the ranch kitchen on a Saturday morning with a jar of apple butter and the expression of a woman who has been given something she wasn't expecting and doesn't quite know how to hold. "They hired me," she said. "The Brennan family. They hired me the day they got your note." Charlotte looked at the jar of apple butter. "You didn't have to bring anything," she said. "I know," Margarita said. "I wanted to." She held the jar out. It was a good jar, properly sealed, the label written in careful script. "You didn't know me. You wrote that note anyway." Charlotte took the jar. Somebody did something like that for me once, she said. It was only partly true. Reverend Aldridge's letter had opened fewer doors than she'd hoped, but the intention was the same. The act of one person saying to a skeptical world, "This one is worth it." "Come in," she said. "Have coffee." Marguerite came in. Charlie Briggs, who was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup, looked up, assessed the situation in about 3 seconds, and said, "Morning," with the absolute equanimity of a man who had watched this kitchen become, over the past 2 months, a place where things happened that hadn't happened before. William noticed. He didn't say anything about it immediately. That was his way to observe and process before speaking, and she had learned to trust that the processing was happening even when the speaking wasn't. But she saw him notice. Saw the way he watched Marguerite at the kitchen table that Saturday morning. Saw the way he looked at the jar of apple butter on the shelf after Marguerite had gone. That evening after supper he said, "The Brennan family hired Marguerite Sullivan." "Yes," Charlotte said. "You wrote them a note." "I did." He looked at his coffee. "You know," he said slowly, "my mother used to do something like that. When she was alive. Someone needed help, she'd find a way to connect them to it." He paused. "I'd forgotten what that looked like." Charlotte was quiet for a moment. "She sounds like she was a good woman," Charlotte said. "She was difficult," William said, with the honesty she'd come to expect from him, "and generous, and opinionated, and she made the best apple cake I've ever eaten, and I've missed her every day since February." He looked up. "The apple butter on the shelf. She used to make it." Charlotte looked at the jar. "I'll make some," she said, "if you'll tell me how she did it." He looked at her. "I don't know how she did it," he said. "I just know what it tasted like." "Then describe it to me," she said, "and I'll figure out how she did it." Something moved across his face that she felt in her sternum. That specific, unguarded thing that happened to his expression sometimes when she said something that reached past his defenses before he'd had time to raise them. "All right," he said quietly. He described it. She listened. She asked 3 questions. He answered them. And somewhere in the middle of talking about his mother's apple butter, he began talking about his mother, not the careful single-sentence version he'd offered before, but the real version, stories and details, and the kind of specific remembered things that told you who a person actually was. The way she'd argued with the Reverend about scripture. The time she'd taken in a stray dog that destroyed the front room, and she'd refused to give it away because she'd made a commitment. The particular look she gave him when she was disappointed, which he'd spent most of his youth trying to avoid. The way she'd said his name when something pleased her. Charlotte sat at the kitchen table and listened, and did not interrupt, and did not make it smaller than it was. When he stopped, the kitchen was quiet. "She would have had opinions about me," Charlotte said. He looked at her. "I told you, the biscuits needed more salt." "She'd have been wrong," Charlotte said. The corner of his mouth moved. "Yes," he said. "She would have." The fire in the range burned low. Neither of them moved to go to bed. The twist that nobody saw coming arrived on a Wednesday in October in the form of Roy McCready. Roy McCready, the mild general store owner with no opinions about his customers. Roy McCready, who had totaled Charlotte's provisions order without incident while Pauline Driscoll appeared at her shoulder. Roy McCready, who Charlotte had categorized as neutral and therefore mostly set aside. He appeared at the ranch on a Wednesday afternoon while William was in the north pasture and Charlotte was alone in the kitchen working through a batch of preserving. He knocked at the back door with his hat in his hands and the expression of a man who had been working up to something for a while. "Miss Hayes," he said, "I was hoping I could speak with you." She let him in, poured coffee and waited. He sat with his hat on his knees and looked at the table. "I owe you an apology," he said. Charlotte said nothing, which was sometimes the most useful response. "That morning in the store," Roy said, "when Mrs. Driscoll came up to you, I heard what was said. I was standing right there and I didn't say anything." He looked up. "I should have said something. I've been in that store 30 years, and I know every person who comes through it, and I know who works hard and who doesn't, and you've come in every week with a proper list and paid your bill on time and never given me a moment's trouble. And when she said what she said, I should have told her to mind her business. He stopped. I didn't, and I'm sorry for it. Charlotte looked at this man who had come 4 miles to say something he hadn't had to say. Thank you, Roy, she said. He nodded, drank his coffee, put his hat back on. There's also something else, he said, which was the thing she hadn't expected. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket and put it on the table. It was a notice. A formal notice printed on good paper for a position. Dust Creek's one-room schoolhouse needed a teacher for the winter term. The previous teacher had left to be married. The school board was advertising. Charlotte looked at the notice. She looked at Roy McCready. I'm not qualified to teach, she said. You can read and write and cipher, Roy said. Better than most in this county, I'd wager. The school board just needs someone who'll show up and not leave after a month. He paused. I told Silas Grant he's on the board about you. He's willing to talk. Charlotte stared at the notice. This was not something she had planned for. She had a position. She had a kitchen and a garden and a room that was hers, and a household she had built back from empty, and she had William Carter's company in the evenings, and his laugh when she surprised it out of him, and the slow, careful, real thing that was growing between them that she was still being patient about. Teaching school was an entirely different life. She picked up the notice and read it carefully. When she put it down, she said, I need to think about this. Of course, Roy said. And I need to speak with William. Roy nodded. He stood and picked up his hat. Miss Hayes, he said at the door. For what it's worth, what I said to Silas Grant was that you were the best qualified person in this county for the job. Not qualified like a certificate. Qualified like someone who knows what it means to have to prove yourself to people who've already decided and who'd be a damn sight better at reaching children who feel the same. Charlotte looked at him. Thank you, Roy, she said again. This time she meant it differently. He left. She stood in the kitchen with the notice in her hand for a long moment. Then she set it on the table and went back to her preserving jars and thought about it through the rest of the afternoon with the focused, systematic attention she gave to serious questions. She was still thinking about it when William came in at dusk. She showed him the notice before supper. She watched him read it, watched his face do the thing where it went still. He put it on the table. What do you want to do? He said. She had been thinking about this question all afternoon, and she had an honest answer. I don't know yet. Is teaching something you've thought about before? No, she said. I hadn't allowed myself to think that far ahead. She looked at the notice. I've been in survival mode long enough that I stopped thinking about what I might want to build and started thinking only about what I could hold on to. She paused. Roy McCready said something that I keep turning over. What did he say? She told him. The part about knowing what it means to prove yourself to people who've already decided. The part about reaching children who felt the same. William was quiet for a moment. He's right, he said. It would mean leaving the ranch, she said. I can't cook here and teach school in town. It's not possible. She looked at him directly. I want you to know that I understand that. I'm not pretending the decision doesn't affect this place. He held her eyes. Charlotte, he said with the particular care he used when he was choosing words precisely, I didn't hire you to keep you. I hired you because you needed work and I needed help, and it was the right thing. What you do with what comes next is yours to decide. She felt that land, the generosity of it, the particular painful generosity of a man who would rather lose something good than hold it against its will. I know, she said. That's why it's a hard question. The silence after that was the specific kind that happened between them, sometimes full, rather than empty, the kind that contained things neither of them had said yet. There might be, William said slowly, another way to think about it. She waited. The schoolhouse is in town, he said. 4 miles. He was looking at the table. If the arrangement were to change. He stopped. Charlotte looked at him. He looked up. What are you saying, William? She said carefully. His jaw tightened slightly. He was not she had learned a man who found certain kinds of saying easy. He found honesty easy, direct practical honesty about work and decisions and the facts of a situation. This other kind, the kind that required naming something you'd been carrying silently for weeks, was harder for him. "I'm saying," he said, "that I don't want you to leave. I'm saying it plainly, so there's no confusion about it later." He held her eyes. "I'm not saying it to keep you from the school position if that's what you want. I'm saying it because you asked what I meant, and I'm not willing to be indirect about it when you ask me a direct question." Charlotte's heart was doing something that she was choosing with significant effort not to let appear on her face. "Say the rest of it," she said. Her voice was even, barely. He looked at her for a long moment. "I've been alone in this house for 4 months before you came," he said. "And in the 4 months before that, I was watching my mother die. And in the 4 years before that, I was keeping this ranch going and telling myself that was enough, and it mostly was." He stopped. "It is not enough anymore. It stopped being enough approximately 37 days after you arrived, and I've been aware of that, and I haven't said it because—" Another stop. "Because I don't know what you want. And I'm not willing to make assumptions about what you want." Charlotte set down the dish towel she was holding. "William," she said. "Yes." "You've been not saying that for how long?" He considered. 6 weeks roughly." 6 weeks. She looked at him. "I have also been not saying something for approximately 6 weeks." He waited. "I think," she said carefully, "that I came here to take a position and do a job and earn my keep and not need anything from anyone that wasn't in the original arrangement because needing things from people had not gone well for me historically." She paused. "I think I've been failing at that for about 6 weeks." He looked at her. Something happened in his expression. The careful management came down just briefly, just far enough that she could see what was behind it, which was warm and real, and something she recognized because she felt it herself. "Charlotte," he said. "I'm not leaving," she said. I'm going to talk to Silas Grant because Roy McCready asked me to, and because it might be something worth considering, but I'm not leaving because you couldn't stop me from leaving if you tried, and I am choosing to stay." She held his gaze. "I want that to be absolutely clear. I am choosing it." He was very still. "Choosing to stay," he said. "As what?" It was a direct question, and he deserved a direct answer. She had told him at the very beginning that she was a woman who asked direct questions rather than speculating, and she owed him the same. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "I think that's a conversation we need to have properly, and not in the middle of a Wednesday evening when there's still supper dishes on the table." She looked at him. "But I'm not going anywhere. That part I know." He held her eyes. Then he nodded once, in the way he agreed to things that mattered, simply without ceremony, with the complete weight of meaning it. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. She picked up the dish towel and turned back to the sink. Her hands were shaking slightly, and she put them in the water so he wouldn't see. Behind her, she heard him pick up his coffee cup. She heard the quiet sound of him settling back into his chair. The ordinary sounds of an ordinary evening in this kitchen that had become without either of them fully noticing when the center of something real. She met with Silas Grant on a Friday. William drove her in. He didn't offer commentary on the meeting, and she didn't ask for it. He said he had business at the feed store, and he'd be there when she was done, and that was that. Silas Grant was a small, precise man who wore spectacles and ran the Dust Creek School Board with the particular energy of someone who cared genuinely about something unglamorous. He shook her hand when she came in, which she noted, and he looked at her face when he spoke, which she also noted. He asked her 3 questions. Whether she could read well, she answered by picking up the primer on his desk and reading 3 paragraphs aloud without error. Whether she could do arithmetic, she did the 4 problems he wrote on the slate without visible effort. Whether she had ever managed a room of children, she told him about the children's home, the 60 residents, the years of organized chaos. He looked at her over his spectacles. "People will say things," he said, "about the board's choice. You're aware of that." "I'm aware of that," she said. "I've been aware of that since I stepped off the stagecoach." "Mrs. Whitmore," he said with the particular tone of a man naming a weather system, "has already been to see me." Charlotte looked at him. "What did she say?" Charlotte asked. "The usual things," Silas said. He took off his spectacles and polished them with a small cloth. I told her I was more interested in who could teach 30 children to read than in what the social committee thought about my staffing decisions. He put his spectacles back on. I also told her that the previous teacher who she had enthusiastically recommended had lasted 6 weeks before leaving, and that perhaps the board's judgment and hers were operating on different criteria. Charlotte felt the beginning of something that might have been a smile. "Mr. Grant," she said, "I want to be straightforward with you." "Please," he said. "I have a position at Mountain View Ranch. I intend to keep that arrangement in some form regardless of what we decide today. I'm not available to leave at the convenience of anyone who decides I've become inconvenient." She paused. "I work hard. I show up on time. I don't quit when things become difficult." Another pause. "If those are the qualities you need, I'm your answer. If you need someone more suitable by other measures, I'm not your answer, and we should both save ourselves the trouble." Silas Grant looked at her for a moment. "Can you start Monday?" he said. Charlotte blinked once. "Yes," she said. He put out his hand. She shook it. She told William on the drive back. He listened, nodded, said Monday. "Monday," she confirmed. She paused. "I'll still cook dinner. The school day ends at 3. I can be back by 4. He was quiet for a moment. "Charlotte," he said, "you don't have to manage everything at once." "I know," she said. "I want to." He looked at the road. "Hector's wife cooks sometimes," he said. "She's offered before. I could ask her for breakfast and midday. You do dinner." He paused. "If that's what you want." She looked at him. He was looking at the road, but his hands on the reins had the slightly tighter grip she'd learned to read as the sign of a man who was carefully not showing what he was thinking. "That would work," she said. "Good," he said. They rode the rest of the way in silence. But it was the warm kind. The kind that happened between people who have said the important things and don't need to fill the space around them. The school term started on a Monday morning and was, in Charlotte's honest assessment, one of the most terrifying things she had done since walking into Dust Creek with a worn suitcase and $11. 31 children, between the ages of 6 and 14, in a single room with 4 different reading levels and approximately 11 different ideas about whether they were interested in being there. 2 boys in the back who had already decided she was not going to be able to manage them. A girl in the front row with eyes like dark water who read 3 levels above her age and was visibly starved for challenge. Several children who looked at Charlotte when she walked in with the specific expression she recognized from 7 doorways, the assessment, the measurement, the conclusion drawn before anything had happened. She stood at the front of the room. She looked at 31 faces. She said, "My name is Miss Hayes. I'm going to tell you one thing on the first day, and then we're going to get to work. I don't care what you've decided about me already. I care what you do while you're in this room. Show me what you can do, and I'll show you what I can do, and we'll see where we end up." The 2 boys in the back exchanged a glance. She looked at them directly. "That includes you 2, she said. One of them almost smiled. By the end of the first week, she had all 31 of them reading something. By the end of the second, she had reorganized them into 4 working groups based on level, which was something the previous teacher had apparently not attempted. By the 3rd week, the girl in the front row with the dark water eyes, whose name was Clara, had read 3 books from Charlotte's own small collection and was working on a 4th. Silas Grant came by on a Thursday to observe. He stood at the back of the room for an hour. When the children had gone for the day, he said, "The Hendersons pulled their son from school this week. Agnes Whitmore's influence, I'd guess." Charlotte looked at him. "I know," she said. 3 other families have inquired about enrollment," he said. "From the south part of town. Dolores Vega sent them." He paused. "I wanted you to know the ledger is running in your favor." Charlotte nodded. "How's the boy who left?" she asked. "The Henderson child." Silas blinked. "I don't know. I imagine he's fine." "He was struggling with reading," Charlotte said. "3rd level behind where he should be for his age. I was going to spend extra time with him." She looked at Silas. "Would you let his mother know that if he wants to come back, I'll work with him specifically, regardless of what Mrs. Henderson thinks of me?" Silas looked at her for a moment. "I'll tell her," he said. The Henderson boy was back the following Monday. His mother did not speak to Charlotte when she dropped him off, but she brought him. And when Charlotte looked up from the front of the room and saw him slide into his seat in the second row, she simply said, "Good morning, Thomas," and moved on, because a child did not need to be made a subject of, and whatever his mother thought was his mother's business, and what happened in this room was hers. On a Friday evening in November, 5 weeks into the school term, Charlotte came back to the ranch at 4:30 to find William on the front porch. This was unusual. He was almost never on the front porch in the late afternoon. He was in the pasture or at the barn or coming in at dusk. She climbed down from the wagon she'd borrowed for the school commute and looked at him. "Everything all right?" she said. "Fine," he said. "Sit down." She sat in the other chair. He handed her a cup of coffee that was still warm, which meant he'd been waiting. She looked at the cup. She looked at him. "William," she said. "I want to ask you something," he said. He was looking at the property in front of them, the yard, the barn, the last of the garden. "And I want to ask it properly, which means I've been thinking about how to say it for a week." She waited. "I told you 6 weeks ago that I didn't want you to leave," he said. "And you told me you were choosing to stay, and that the rest of it needed a proper conversation." He paused. "I think we've been putting off that conversation for 6 weeks." "We have," she agreed. He turned to look at her. "I'm not good at this," he said. "I want you to know that up front. I'm good at cattle, and I'm good at land, and I'm not good at—" He stopped. "At saying the thing I mean when the thing I mean is the kind of thing that matters past the cattle and the land." "William," she said, "just say it." He held her eyes. "I want to marry you," he said. The November air moved around them. Charlotte set her coffee cup down on the porch railing very carefully. "Say that again," she said. "I want to marry you," he said again, with the same directness he'd used the first time, like a man who had decided to say a true thing and would keep saying it as many times as necessary. "I have wanted it for approximately 8 weeks, and I have been not saying it for approximately 8 weeks because I was not sure." He stopped. "Because I didn't know what you wanted, and I still don't. But I'm done not asking because not asking is its own kind of answer, and I don't want that answer." Charlotte looked at him. She thought about 7 doors. She thought about a suitcase in the dirt. She thought about a man crossing a street for no reason, except that he was tired of watching, and a kitchen that had a sound again, and 31 children learning to read, and a jar of apple butter on a shelf, and a reel played on a fiddle in a churchyard, while all of Dust Creek watched, and she took his hand anyway. She thought about the woman she'd been in Abilene, the woman who had stopped letting herself think past survival, who had closed down the part of herself that wanted things, because wanting things that didn't come hurt in a specific way she'd gotten tired of. She thought about what it had cost her to open that part back up. She thought about whether it was worth it. She thought yes. "William Carter," she said. "Yes," he said. "I have been an orphan in a children's home, a domestic worker in 7 households, a cook on a cattle ranch, and a school teacher," she said. "I have been turned away from more doors than I can count. I have been described in terms I will not repeat by people whose opinion I do not intend to carry." She looked at him steadily. "I am not a woman who says yes to things because they're convenient, or because I have limited options. I have proven I think that I can survive limited options." "You have," he said. "So when I say yes," she said, "I want you to understand that it is because I want to, not because I need to, not because the alternative is worse, because I want to." He looked at her. "Is that a yes?" he said. "Yes," she said. "It is absolutely a yes." Something happened in William Carter's face that she had never seen there before. Something that had been held back for a very long time came through warm and unguarded and entirely real, and he looked at her with all of it showing, and it was the most honestly she had ever seen him look at anything. He reached out and took her hand. Not the way you take a hand at a dance with half an eye on the room around you. The way you take a hand when the room doesn't matter, and the town doesn't matter, and the letters and the committees and the Agnes Whitmores of the world don't matter. And the only thing that matters is the person in front of you, and the choice both of you are making. Charlotte looked down at their joined hands. She thought about saying something else. There was more to say. There was always more to say when you were a woman who had lived in careful words for as long as she had. But for once, for this specific once, she let the moment be what it was without filling it. She turned their joined hands over and held his, the way you hold something you mean to keep. The November evening settled around the ranch. In the west, the sky was going red and gold, in the particular extravagance of a Texas sunset. And on the front porch of Mountain View Ranch, a man who had forgotten what it felt like to not be alone, and a woman who had spent her whole life being told she was too much sat together in the last of the light and held on. They told no one immediately. That was Charlotte's request, and William honored it without asking why, because by now he understood how she thought, methodically carefully, with the particular caution of a woman who had learned that good things announced too early had a way of being interfered with before they could take root. She needed a few days to hold it quietly, to let it be real to her before it became real to anyone else. He gave her that. He gave her the days. He went about the ranch and she went about the school and the kitchen, and nothing outward changed except that something between them had settled into a different register. Warmer, less careful. The specific ease of two people who have said the true thing and no longer have to manage the space around it. On the third morning, he came into the kitchen at 5:15, and she had his coffee waiting, and she looked up when he came through the door and smiled at him. Not the small, contained, almost smile she usually permitted herself. The full one. The one that did what her smiles did, changed something in the room. William Carter stopped in the doorway and looked at her like a man who had not yet gotten used to that smile being aimed at him, and wasn't entirely sure he was going to. "Morning," she said. "Morning," he said, and sat down and picked up his coffee and looked at her over the rim of it for a moment longer than necessary. "Stop that," she said, turning back to the stove. "Stop what?" he said. "Looking at me like that before I've had my coffee." "You've had your coffee," he said. "You've had 2 cups. I can see the evidence." She turned around. I was watching her with an expression that was warm and openly amused and entirely undisguised. And it was the most unguarded she had ever seen him at 5:15 in the morning or at any other hour, and she thought, this is what it looks like when he stops managing it. This, right here, this is what's been behind all of it. "William," she said. "Charlotte," he said. "I think we should tell people on Sunday." He nodded. "All right. Charlie first," she said. "He deserves to hear it from us before he hears it from anyone else." Agreed. "And Hector." "Yes." She turned back to the stove. "And I need to write a letter to Reverend Aldridge. He should know. He's the closest thing to family I have." She said it plainly, the way she said things that were true and slightly painful, without making a production of the truth or the pain. Just a statement. Reverend Aldridge in Abilene, who had written her a letter of character reference that nobody in Dust Creek had wanted to read, was the closest thing to family she had. Behind her, William was quiet. Then he said, "Charlotte." "Yes." "Write to him," he said, "and invite him." She turned. "To the wedding," he said. "If he can come, invite him. I want someone who knows you there, someone who knew you before." He paused. "You deserve that." She looked at him. She had been holding herself very steadily since the night on the porch, keeping the emotion of it at a practical distance, because practical was what she knew how to be. But this specific sentence, "someone who knew you before," reached past all of it and found the place she'd been keeping carefully padded since she was old enough to understand what it meant to have no one who remembered you as a child. She pressed her hands against the edge of the stove. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was even, just barely. "Don't thank me," he said. "Just write the letter." She wrote it that evening. Charlie Briggs received the news on a Sunday morning at the kitchen table with his coffee in his hand and his face doing the very focused work of a man processing something significant. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "About time," and drank his coffee. Charlotte laughed. It came out before she could measure it, a real laugh, surprised and full, and William looked at her with the expression he had when she laughed, which was the expression of a man who had found something he hadn't been looking for and was still slightly astonished by it. Charlie looked between them. "I mean it as a compliment," he said with great dignity. "I know," Charlotte said, still recovering. "To both of you," Charlie said. He raised his coffee cup. It was not an elaborate toast. It was Charlie Briggs, so it was 2 words and a gesture, and it was entirely sincere. Hector. When William told him that afternoon, said nothing for a moment. Then he shook William's hand, turned to Charlotte and said, "The tomatoes will be good again next year. I'll make sure of it." Which was, Charlotte understood his version of the same thing Charlie had said. It was a commitment to her future here. A welcome. She thanked him and meant it. Pete, who overheard from the barn doorway, and was not exactly told, but could not be expected to unhear things he'd heard, appeared at the kitchen door that evening, with his hat in his hands, and said, "Miss Charlotte, I'm real glad," and looked so genuinely pleased that she gave him the last of the dried apple pie, which made him even more pleased, and which she decided was entirely worth it. The news reached Dust Creek by Tuesday. Charlotte had expected this. Small towns had their own communication infrastructure that operated faster than any telegraph and required no equipment. By Tuesday afternoon, Silas Grant knew. By Wednesday morning, Dolores Vega knew. By Wednesday evening, based on the quality of the silence when Charlotte walked into McCready's for supplies, Roy McCready had known for at least a day. He looked at her when she came to the counter. "Congratulations," he said. "Thank you, Roy." He wrapped her flower and didn't say anything else, which was appropriate and sufficient. What Charlotte had not expected, what she had specifically not let herself expect, because expectation in that direction had always cost her, was what happened at the school on Thursday. She arrived Thursday morning to find Clara waiting outside the school door. Clara, the girl with the dark water eyes, who read 3 levels above her age and had become over the past weeks a quiet daily presence. Charlotte had come to look forward to, in the specific way you look forward to something that gives you back more than you put in. Clara was 10 years old, and she was standing outside the school door with a look on her face that was trying very hard to be composed and not entirely succeeding. "Clara," Charlotte said, "you're early." "I heard something," Clara said. Charlotte unlocked the door. "Come in." They went in. The room was empty and cold, and smelled of chalk, and the particular dry smell of books in a small space. Charlotte started the stove, and Clara stood near it and said, "I heard you're getting married, to Mr. Carter." "I am," Charlotte said. "Does that mean—" Clara stopped. Her jaw was very tight. "Does that mean you're leaving the school?" Charlotte looked at her. "No," she said. Clara blinked. "I'm marrying William Carter," Charlotte said. "I'm not stopping being a teacher. Married women can teach school, Clara." She paused. "They don't always get to because people have opinions about it. But I have a school board member who cares more about whether children learn to read than what the social committee thinks, and I intend to continue until he tells me otherwise." She looked at the girl directly. "I'm not going anywhere." Clara's composure held for approximately 3 more seconds. Then it didn't. She didn't cry loudly. She was a private, self-contained child who had learned Charlotte suspected to keep her feelings small and manageable because they hadn't always been safe to show. But her eyes filled, and she pressed her mouth together and looked at the floor. Charlotte crossed the room and crouched down to her level. "Clara," she said. Clara looked up. "You are the brightest student I have," Charlotte said. "You are going to read every book in this county, and then you are going to need books from somewhere else, and I intend to help you find them. That doesn't change because I'm getting married." Clara nodded. "Once." Then she wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, with the efficient determination of someone who had decided she was done with that now. "All right," she said. "Good," Charlotte said. She stood. "Put your coat on the peg. The others will be here in 10 minutes." Clara put her coat on the peg. Charlotte turned back to the stove. Her own eyes were doing something she did not address. She let it pass the way she let most things pass, by keeping her hands moving and her back straight and giving herself 30 seconds and then continuing. Agnes Whitmore came to the ranch on a Friday. Charlotte saw the buggy coming from the kitchen window. She recognized the horse, a good gray mare that Agnes kept well. She dried her hands and went to the front door and opened it before Agnes had finished coming up the porch steps. Agnes stopped. For a moment they simply looked at each other. Two women on a porch in the November cold, with a specific history between them. Agnes was dressed well as always. But something in her posture was different from the last time Charlotte had seen her at the social. Less armor. Not less composed, she was always composed, but the composition was sitting differently. Less aggressive, more tired. "Mrs. Whitmore," Charlotte said. "Miss Hayes," Agnes said. Then, with the slight pause of a woman correcting herself, "I've heard the news. I suppose I should say Mrs. Carter soon." "You can go on saying Miss Hayes," Charlotte said. "Is William here?" "I came to see you," Agnes said. Charlotte looked at her for a moment. Then she stepped back from the doorway. "Come in," she said. Agnes came in. Charlotte brought her to the kitchen, not the front parlor, because this was the room she worked in, and the room she was most herself in, and she was done adjusting herself to suit other people's comfort, and poured coffee, and set it in front of Agnes, and sat across from her. Agnes looked at the coffee. She looked at the kitchen. She looked at the rows of preserved jars on the shelves, the organized provisions, the clean work table, the small practical signs of a household being run with genuine skill and care. She looked at all of it for a moment. "I owe you an apology," she said. Charlotte said nothing. "I said things in a letter," Agnes continued, "that I wrote in pride and in a kind of jealousy that I am not proud of. I described you in terms that were unkind and inaccurate, and I said them to a bank manager who had no business hearing them, and I used my position in this town to try to make your situation here impossible." She kept her eyes level. She was whatever else she was, a woman who could look at the thing she was confessing without looking away from it. "I want you to know that I understand what I did, and I am sorry for it." The kitchen was quiet. Charlotte looked at her. Agnes Whitmore had spent months making her life difficult, had described her body in writing with clinical contempt, had gone to a bank and used words like unsound judgment about a man Charlotte had come to about William, had organized social pressure and community machinery and all the considerable tools of a woman with standing and connections, and had aimed them all at Charlotte's right to simply be here and do good work. Charlotte thought about what she wanted to say. She thought about every closed door, every whisper, every version of "you are too much" or "not enough" or "not right" that she had absorbed and carried and not let break her. She thought about whether forgiving Agnes Whitmore required pretending none of that had happened. She decided it didn't. "I accept your apology," she said. "I want to be honest with you about what I'm accepting and what I'm not. I accept that you're sorry. I believe you mean it." She paused. "I don't accept that what you did was a small thing. It wasn't. Letters like that follow women like me. A bank manager having doubts about William's judgment because of me could have cost this ranch real money, and it nearly made me leave, which would have cost me the first position I've had, where someone looked at my work instead of my size." Agnes held her eyes. "I know," she said. It was very quiet. "I'm not saying this to continue punishing you," Charlotte said. "I'm saying it so that it's said, and so we don't have to pretend it isn't true, and so that when I say I accept your apology, you know that I'm not saying it didn't matter." Agnes nodded. A silence. "You are," Agnes said finally, with the particular quality of a woman making herself say something she didn't want to say. "Exactly the kind of woman this town needs. I recognized it in McCready's store when you answered me back. I was angry about it at the time." She looked at her coffee. "William Carter is a lucky man." "He's a good man," Charlotte said. "That's what I care about more." Something in Agnes shifted. A very small release, like a breath held too long, finally let out. "Yes," she said. "He is." She left 20 minutes later. She didn't stay for more coffee, and Charlotte didn't press her to. But when she went out the front door, the quality of her departure was different from every other time Charlotte had watched her go. Less triumphant, less armored, more human. Charlotte stood in the kitchen and thought about it. She was not going to become Agnes Whitmore's friend. Some things that happened between people left marks that were real and permanent and didn't disappear because the other person eventually said sorry. But she was also not a woman who needed to carry old grudges into new seasons. She had enough to carry. She was going to put that one down. She went back to the stove. She had dinner to make. Reverend Aldridge wrote back in 3 weeks. The letter arrived on a cold December morning, and Charlotte recognized the handwriting on the envelope. Careful, deliberate, the handwriting of a man who had spent 40 years composing sermons and believed words should be chosen with intention. She opened it at the kitchen table. He was coming. He would be there for the wedding in January. He wrote, more pleased than he could properly express in a letter, though he attempted several paragraphs of it anyway. He said he had always known from the first day Charlotte had come to the home at age 4 and organized the other children's shoes by size before anyone had asked her to, that she was going to build something real in this world. He said the only thing he had ever regretted was that the world had made her prove it the hard way. He said, "You deserved better than what you were given at the start, Charlotte. I am glad you have found what you were owed." Charlotte sat at the kitchen table in the cold December morning with the letter in her hands and let herself cry. Not the managed behind the livery stable kind, the real kind. Quietly, without an audience, in the kitchen of her own house, with the coffee warm on the stove and the morning light coming through the east window, she let it go on for exactly as long as it needed to. Then she wiped her face, folded the letter carefully, and went to tell William that Reverend Aldridge was coming. They were married on a Saturday in January 1880 in the First Presbyterian Church of Dust Creek, Texas. The ceremony was small by some measures and large by others. Small because Charlotte had not wanted spectacle. She had said specifically that she wanted a real ceremony, not a performance, and William had said fine and meant it. Large because people came anyway, because a town that had spent months forming opinions about Charlotte Hayes had, in its complicated human way, become invested in how the story ended. Charlie Briggs and Hector and Pete sat in the third row and cleaned up considerably better than Charlotte had expected. Dolores Vega came with 4 of her boarders, Silas Grant and his wife, Marguerite Sullivan, who had come 40 miles from the Brennan Ranch specifically, and arrived with a jar of preserves and the wide, warm smile of a woman who understood what this particular ceremony meant. 31 children from the Dust Creek School had apparently organized themselves with no prompting from anyone to stand outside the church when the ceremony let out. Charlotte discovered this when she and William walked out into the January air and found them there, 31 children in their coats, standing in an uneven row on the church steps, and Clara at the front of the row with her dark water eyes and her composed face and a small bunch of dried winter flowers that she had clearly gathered and bundled herself. Clara held them out. Charlotte stopped walking. She looked at the flowers. She looked at Clara. She looked at the row of 31 children who had come on a Saturday in the cold because their teacher was getting married. "These are from all of us," Clara said. "I organized it." "I can see that," Charlotte said. "Thomas helped," Clara added, which was clearly both true and magnanimous, because Thomas Henderson and Clara had a complicated classroom relationship involving competitive reading speeds. Thomas Henderson, from the middle of the row, looked both guilty and proud. Charlotte took the flowers. She held them carefully, the way she had held William's hand on the porch, the way you hold something you mean to keep. "Thank you," she said. "All of you." William beside her looked at the row of children and then at Charlotte, and his face did the thing it had been doing more frequently lately. The unguarded, warm, entirely undisguised thing that she no longer tried to look away from. He leaned down and said quietly, close enough that only she could hear, "Exceptional teacher." "Obviously," she said. He laughed. Reverend Aldridge, on the church steps behind them, watched Charlotte Hayes, Charlotte Carter, now standing in the January cold with a handful of dried flowers and 31 children and a man who laughed the way people laughed when they meant it. And he looked like a man who had been given in his old age the satisfaction of seeing something he had hoped for come true. The years that followed were not perfect. Nothing real was. The ranch had good years and hard years, a drought in 1882 that stretched everyone thin, a cattle illness in 1884 that cost them 24 head and 3 months of sleep. The school had its politics and its difficulties. Parents who objected and board members who wavered, and one year when the funding nearly didn't come through, Charlotte taught through all of it. She taught through the drought and the illness and the funding difficulties and the parents who objected, and she taught through her own exhaustion on the days when she came home from school and still needed to think about the ranch and still needed to be present for William, who had his own exhaustion from his own work. They learned to lean. That was the thing neither of them had known how to do before both of them had spent so long being self-sufficient that leaning felt like failure. They had to learn that leaning on someone who wanted to hold your weight was not failure. It was the whole point. William learned to tell her when the ranch was going badly instead of carrying it alone and turning quiet in ways she had to decode. Charlotte learned to come home from a hard school day and say it was hard today instead of managing it to silence before she walked through the door. Small things. Daily things. The actual architecture of a life built together. Clara went on reading. By the time she was 14, she had consumed everything available in Dust Creek, and Charlotte had begun writing to a woman she'd corresponded with in Austin, who ran a small lending library and who sent crates of books twice a year addressed to Charlotte Carter Mountain View Ranch. Clara came out to the ranch on Saturdays to collect them and sometimes stayed for dinner, and William would ask her what she was reading with the same genuine interest he brought to everything he cared about, and Clara would tell him in great detail, while Pete, who had no interest in books, listened politely and ate considerably more biscuits than his share. Marguerite Sullivan married a man named Torres from the ranch to the west and had 2 daughters and brought them both to Charlotte's school. And on the first day she brought them, she stood in the doorway and looked at Charlotte at the front of the room and nodded once. The specific nod of a woman recognizing something she understood, and Charlotte nodded back. Dolores Vega retired from the boarding house in 1885 and left it to a young woman named Iris, who had come from New Mexico with no connections and 2 references, and who Charlotte had vouched for to 3 separate suspicious parties before anyone would give Iris a fair hearing. Iris ran the boarding house well and sent Charlotte a jar of green chili preserves every Christmas for 12 years. The town changed. Not all at once, and not entirely, and not without setbacks. But Dust Creek in 1885 was a different place from Dust Creek in 1879, in the ways that mattered more, willing slowly and imperfectly to give a person a hearing before a verdict. Charlotte did not take credit for this. She did not think one woman's determination caused a community to rethink its values. She thought communities were changed by accumulation, by the sum of small choices made by many people. Roy McCready going out of his way to knock on a door. Dolores Vega sending women to Charlotte's school. Silas Grant telling Agnes Whitmore that his criteria were different from hers. She thought change was mostly invisible until it suddenly wasn't. The twist that arrived in the autumn of 1886 came in a form no one had predicted. It came as a letter from the Texas State Department of Education. Charlotte had been nominated. She had no idea by whom, and the letter did not say for a state commendation for teaching in rural communities. The commendation came with a small sum of money for school resources and an invitation to a convening of teachers in Austin in the spring. She read the letter 4 times at the kitchen table. Then she put it down and looked at the wall. William came in at dusk and found her sitting there. "What happened?" he said immediately. She handed him the letter. He read it. He looked up. "Charlotte," he said. "I don't know who nominated me," she said. "I do," he said. She looked at him. "Silas Grant," he said. "He mentioned it to me in September. He asked if I thought you'd object." "You knew." Her voice was not angry. It was stunned. "For 6 weeks," he said. He set the letter on the table. "I wanted to tell you, but Silas said the nominations were reviewed in October, and it wasn't guaranteed, and I didn't want to—" He stopped. "I didn't want you to be disappointed if it didn't come through." She looked at him. "You were protecting me from a disappointment," she said. "Yes," he said with the slight wince of a man who knows he's about to be told he should have handled something differently. Charlotte was quiet for a moment. "William," she said. "I know," he said. "I should have told you." "You should have told me," she agreed. "I don't need to be protected from the possibility of disappointment. I've been disappointed before. I survive it." "I know that," he said. "I know." He looked at the letter. "I'm sorry. I wanted it to come through for you." She looked at him. This man who had burned 2 letters in a kitchen stove and crossed a street for no reason, except that he was tired of watching, and who had learned imperfectly and genuinely and still in progress to lean, and who had just admitted to 6 weeks of carrying something for her with the specific, slightly misguided protectiveness of a person who loved someone and sometimes didn't know how to show it except by trying to keep bad things away. "I'm going to Austin," she said. "Yes," he said. "You are. And next time Silas Grant does something like this," she said, "you tell me, even if it might not come through." "Yes," he said. "Good." She picked up the letter. "I need to write back to accept." He nodded. She got up and went to the writing desk and found paper and dipped the pen, and she was 3 lines into the acceptance letter when she heard his voice behind her. "Charlotte." She turned. Howe was standing in this kitchen doorway with his hands in his pockets and the look on his face that she knew now, the unguarded one, the warm one, the one he gave her when something had moved him and he was past trying to manage it. "What?" she said. "I'm proud of you," he said. "I should say it more, and I know that. But I want you to know it." She looked at him. She thought about a morning 7 years ago. A leather suitcase in the dirt, $11 in her pocket, and 7 closed doors. She thought about all the things she'd been told she was and wasn't and couldn't be and wouldn't find and didn't deserve. She thought about the particular accumulated weight of being told in 100 ways, large and small, that you were too much and not enough and not right. She thought about what it felt like to hear, "I'm proud of you," from a person who meant it and had earned the right to say it. "I know," she said gently. "I know you are." She turned back to the letter. She wrote it to the end. She signed it in her careful hand, Charlotte Carter, Dust Creek School, Dust Creek, Texas. She set down the pen. Outside, the October evening was going gold and cool, and the ranch was doing what it did at dusk, settling the sound of cattle far off, and the horses in the barn, and the creek running thin, and the oak trees along the bank going rust and amber. She listened to it. She had built this. Not alone. She had never done anything alone, had learned that leaning was not weakness. But the whole point, had learned it from William, and from Charlie, and from Hector, and from Clara, with her dark water eyes, and from 31 children standing on church steps in January, holding dried flowers. She had built it with all of them. But she had been here. She had stayed when leaving would have been easier. She had opened the parts of herself she'd closed down and let things grow in it, and the things had grown. William came and stood beside her at the window. They stood there in the way they stood on the porch, sometimes close, comfortable, the specific ease of people who have been through real things together and know each other past the surface. "Do you remember," he said, "the first morning you came into this kitchen?" "I remember everything about it," she said. "I came down and you had coffee made and you were writing a provisions list," he said. "And I thought," he stopped. "I thought, here is a person who knows what she's doing. And I didn't think I'd needed that. I thought I'd just needed someone to cook." "And," she said. "And I was wrong about what I needed," he said. "By about the second day." She turned and looked at him. The late light was in his face. The dark eyes, the rough jaw, the small scar below his cheekbone that she knew now from years of proximity. The face of a man who had learned slowly and genuinely to let someone in past the cattle and the land. "William," she said. "Yes. I came to this town with nothing," she said. 7 doors closed, $11, 1 letter that nobody wanted to read. She held his eyes. "I have everything now. Everything I was told I would never find." He looked at her. "So do I," he said. He took her hand. The evening deepened around them. The ranch settled into its night sounds. Somewhere down the road, Dust Creek, Texas, was being its complicated, imperfect, slowly changing self. And at Mountain View Ranch, in a kitchen that had a sound again, and a garden that came back every spring, and a house that had been for 7 years a home, 2 people stood at a window and held on. Charlotte Carter had been the woman nobody wanted. She had become the heart of everything, and the world that had tried so hard to make her believe she was too much had not won, had not come close, because the woman it underestimated had simply kept going and kept building and kept offering her hands and her heart and her stubborn, inextinguishable belief that she was worth something until the world ran out of closed doors and the only thing left was this ranch, this man, this kitchen with its sound and its warmth and its 43 jars of preserved tomatoes and a letter from the state of Texas on the desk. This life. Hers. Fully and completely hers. And that every closed door, every whispered cruelty, every letter burned in a kitchen stove, every choice made and held and fought for, that was worth every single step of the road that had led her here. She squeezed his hand. He squeezed back. The fire in the range burned warm and steady. And outside, the first stars appeared over the West Texas sky, the same stars she had stood under on her first night at this ranch, looking up and feeling for the first time in as long as she could remember like she was not standing outside a closed door. She had been right. She had never been standing outside. She had been all along walking toward the only door that was always going to open, the one she had earned with her hands and her heart, and her refusal to stop believing she deserved it. It was open now. It had been open for years. And Charlotte Carter walked through it every single day, and every single day she chose to stay.